Before we drift into tonight's story, whether you're here to rest, to unwind, or simply letting this play softly as you fall asleep, I'm really glad you're here. Tell me in the comments, what's one place in the world you'd love to see in person one day? If you find peace and calm history like this, a like or a subscribe helps this series reach more gentle minds who love Rome's story as much as you do. And quietly, almost everyone who listens, about 99%, isn't subscribed yet. If that's you, maybe take a moment to join us. It helps more than you'd imagine. Now, settle in, let your shoulders relax, breathe slowly, and let's begin our journey. Before the world woke, Florence was already dreaming. The river shimmered like brushed silver beneath the last stars. Light leaned over the water and touched the roofs like a quiet promise. No trumpets, no fanfare, only dawn finding stone, the same way an idea finds its form. Workshops stirred. The smell of wood smoke and pigment drifted through open shutters. Brushes waited in jars beside still water. Somewhere, a bell suggested the hour but did not insist upon it. It was morning, but it was also beginning. Florence was not yet the Renaissance. It was a city trying to remember how to look clearly, how to see the world as it was, and in doing so make it new. They came from across the sea, crates sealed with wax and sea salt. Inside, words thought lost to time. Greek, pure, direct, resonant. Philosophers who had spoken in Byzantium's last light now whispered again in Italy's dawn. Aristotle arranged thoughts like architecture. Plato's sentences glowed like lanterns. Even Euclid seemed patient with his rediscovered voice. Scholars opened the pages slowly, as though the ink might crumble under air. They read aloud, their voices shaking slightly, not from effort but recognition. The sound was ancient, but it fit the room. Like music remembered. Before presses, there were wrists, ink like patience, margins where thought wandered. Scribes copied, letter by letter, as if time depended on it, and perhaps it did. Every stroke is an act of faith. Every page is a bridge between centuries. When a student held a fresh copy to the morning sun, the parchment glowed. He turned to his teacher and whispered, "It's alive." The master nodded, knowing what he meant. Brunelleschi stood beneath the skeleton of his dome and listened. Not for voices, for silence. The silence of design fitting itself together. Ribs curving like breath. Bricks winding upward like a slow prayer. Florence had borrowed the geometry of Constantinople and taught it to speak in Tuscan light. Onlookers gasped, some prayed, a few wept. No one knew why. Perhaps because the city, in that moment, felt its inheritance, the dream of the East, reborn in the West. Cicero's cadence, Virgil's calm, Seneca's discipline. Their words were not relics now, but instruments tuned to modern air. Students copied phrases into wax, then into memory. They whispered them on walks home as if reciting a spell against forgetting. In every corner of the city, language grew deliberate again, clear, balanced, confident. Rome's voice, rediscovered. Not to rule, but to remind myself. Color became theology. The line became a prayer. The gold leaf met the sunlight and understood it. Painters still spoke in faith, but faith now wore human faces. Shadows honored light instead of fearing it. Perspective curved like mercy. A patron gazed upon a fresco and felt for the first time that holiness could be logical, that divinity might be exact. Florence debated softly, not for dominance, for understanding. Artisans argued in courtyards about circles and souls. Bakers admired the geometry of loaves. Goldsmiths measured grace by weight. Proportion became the quiet ethic of the city. To do one's work well was to make peace visible. There was no proclamation, no moment called the Renaissance. Only a city that looked up from its work and saw morning where it had expected darkness. They had not conquered, they had remembered. Because the light that moved west did not replace the old flame. It borrowed it, cupped it carefully, and carried it into the day. No one planned the handover. There was no council, no signature. The knowledge simply moved, through exiles, through merchants, through monks who carried scrolls rolled in linen as if they were sleeping infants. A scribe leaving Constantinople after its fall carried a single chest on his back. Inside, Aristotle, Euclid, and a few letters of the Church Fathers. He crossed mountains. He slept in barns. When he reached Venice, he sold none of it. He found a student instead, a Florentine with questions larger than gold. That is how civilizations survive. Not by decree, but by the stubborn gentleness of memory. And in Florence, memory began to take root again. Workshops filled with parchment, ink, and candlelight. Copyists hummed as they worked, not songs, but syllables. Each line tested the thickness of the pen's whisper. Paper smelled of almond oil and dust. Margins blossomed with notes and miniature thoughts. A reader in 1452 could trace not only the words of Plato, but the breathing of those who had copied him. When the first presses came, they were treated like miracles. Metal, turning knowledge into multiplication. Ideas that once required years, now I have traveled for months. Printers inked plates and crossed themselves. They said the smell of oil and paper was the scent of progress. Books became seeds, and Florence, the soil. Out in the hills of Fiesole, a circle of thinkers gathered in the open air. They called it the Platonic Academy, though no tuition was charged, and the only curriculum was wonder. Marsilio Ficino read Plato aloud in Latin, his voice measured, patient, reverent. Lorenzo de' Medici listened, fingers tracing the edge of a coin. They spoke of the soul, of the divine proportion, of how beauty might be proof of truth. Below them, Florence sparkled in evening light, a map of terraces, towers, and ideas. The city was beginning to think like itself. Florence had no emperor. Its rulers were merchants, its palaces banks, its armies apprentices with chisels. Power here was persuasion. If an idea could be shown to work in marble, it became law. Brunelleschi proved gravity could be reasoned with. Ghiberti proved metal could think in curves. Donatello gave bronze a pulse. And every craftsman watching learned the same lesson, that faith and skill were not opposites. In the cool mornings, streets rang with hammers and lutes alike. Sculptors argued with theologians about proportion. A mason might quote Aristotle. A painter might lecture on optics. The line between sacred and secular blurred into focus. Florence became its own republic of mind, governed by measure, inspired by grace. Painters began to study faces not as symbols, but as topographies of light. Masaccio painted shadows that obeyed geometry. Fra Angelico built heaven from stillness. Botticelli let myth breathe in mortal skin. The saints looked more human. The humans looked more divine. Art learned that truth did not require miracle, only honesty. At night, apprentices swept the studios and whispered about the impossible things they'd seen, perspective that could bend distance, eyes that followed you from the wall, stories told without words. They didn't call it progress, they called it work. In monasteries, music changed too. The plain song stretched into harmony, as if thought itself were finding dimension. A composer added a second voice and felt the shock of space opening inside sound. He wrote, "Two lines walking together are a mirror." Florence began to sound different, bells tuned to frequency, chants aligned with mathematics. Even silence had structure now. People began to hear time. Not all architecture is stone. Some are waiting. The cathedral dome took 16 years, the bronze doors 27. The translation of Plato's complete works, almost 40. Every project was a dialogue with time itself. The builders were not impatient, they were faithful. They believed perfection required rest between attempts, that a pause was as sacred as an action. They built as though the city could feel their restraint. Florence learned to breathe with them, inhale during conception, exhale upon completion. Painters tested light the way alchemists tested gold. They watched it pool in copper bowls, shiver on water, slope across plaster. Light became a teacher, critic, and scripture. It forgave errors by revealing them. It blessed the patient's hand. Under its guidance, the city itself changed color. Walls pale enough to catch morning, arches soft enough to cradle dusk. And in the reflection on the Arno, Florence began to recognize itself. Old Rome spoke through marble, Byzantium through mosaics. Florence answered with dialogue. Philosophers wrote letters to painters, sculptors discussed theology, merchants financed astronomers. No one feared the mixture. Knowledge was no longer owned, it was shared like bread. In that exchange, the city found humility. Every mind needed another. Every craft, its echo. Evening returned. Workshops closed their shutters. Domes cooled in violet air. A few lights stayed burning. Students bent over pages, architects recalculating curves, musicians adjusting a dissonant chord until it sighed into place. No one declared victory. There was only continuation. Florence was dreaming with its eyes open. At night, the Arno whispered against its banks, carrying silt from mountains that had once known Roman footsteps. Bits of marble, flakes of tile, dust from forgotten roads, the physical residue of the empire. The river didn't mourn. It was delivered. It brought those grains downstream to the very heart of the city that now carried Rome's light. And in that endless current, the world's memory flowed west. There was no moment called the Renaissance, no bell announced it, no chronicle pinned its first breath to a date. It was simply morning. Work continues, people looking up. They thought they were only living, but they were also inheriting, because the light that moved west did not replace the old flame. It borrowed it, cupped it carefully, and carried it into the day. Every rebirth begins in silence, not with trumpets, but with hands learning again what they once knew. After centuries of noise, wars, crusades, councils, collapse, Europe paused long enough to listen. Florence, Venice, Padua, even distant Bruges and Seville felt the hush settle across their workshops. It was not peace, it was attention. People had lived through too much forgetting. Now they wanted to remember, and remembrance began with creation. Libraries became the new cathedrals, not built to contain relics, but ideas. Scribes still copied by hand, but now beside the press, not in place of it. The old and new technologies coexisted, like generations sharing a bench. In one corner, an elder monk whispered, "Write slowly, the ink remembers." In another, a printer smiled, "Print quickly, the world is waiting." Between them, an understanding formed. Speed and silence could serve the same truth. Sheets dried in rows like prayers. Typecases clinked softly, metal vowels waiting to speak. The smell of oil and paper became the perfume of thought. Every age requires its patrons. The Medici were merchants, but what they sold, in the end, was a possibility. Lorenzo, called Il Magnifico, understood that beauty could be currency. He funded poets as he funded banks. He measured return, not in coin, but in conversation. His palace was a parliament of art. Philosophers dined beside sculptors, musicians played between debates. Even the servants carried fragments of poetry in their pockets. Power disguised itself as culture. Culture disguised itself as faith. And in that illusion, both became real. Florence glowed from within, like marble lit by oil. In a small workshop off the Via dei Servi, a boy stood on a stool to reach the canvas. He ground pigments into paste, mixed them with oil and egg, and wondered how light could be trapped in liquid. His master corrected him gently. Light is never trapped, it is persuasive. That boy, Leonardo, learned more from the angle of a brush than from 1,000 sermons. He studied wings, gears, and ripples in water. He saw no boundary between faith and function. To him, anatomy was scripture, mechanics a prayer, and in every sketch he was building memory, not of empire, but of possibility. Elsewhere, in a monastery courtyard, a friar measured shadows with a sundial. He charted the movement of light as if it were a visitation. His name was Fra Luca Pacioli. He would teach a generation to see numbers as moral truths. God, he said, is symmetry. Beside him, a younger man, quiet, observant, translated that symmetry into pigment. That man was Raphael. Together they gave grace its blueprint. The divine found its ratio. The human found its measure. And so, Florence taught the world that order was not confinement, but compassion given structure. Masons spoke of domes the way poets spoke of rhyme. Each line, each joint, a question answered in rhythm. In the workshops of Brunelleschi and Alberti, young architects learned to hear mathematics. They drew columns by candlelight, not to copy Rome, but to continue it. Their sketches were quiet dialogues between reason and devotion. Every arch a sentence, every vault a pause, every facade a memory that refused to fade. They did not call themselves architects. They called themselves servants of proportion, because proportion, like prayer, was an act of trust. Guilds ruled the city like miniature republics. Painters swore oaths beside weavers. Goldsmiths debated with masons. The value of art was no longer divine decree, it was a civic responsibility. When a wall was frescoed, it belonged to the people. When a statue was raised, it stood for the city, not a king. Even merchants quoted Cicero, "Work binds us." Florence had rediscovered the Roman virtue of labor, but turned it inward from conquest to craft. A hammer became an argument. A chisel, a form of peacekeeping. The hand replaced the legion. At night, scholars met over wine. The table became a compass. East met West again, but now in conversation. Arabs, Greeks, Italians, their languages braided into Latin the way roots braid under soil. They debated God, nature, and numbers. They disagreed politely. They listened. One traveler from Damascus wrote, "These men talk like builders. They lay foundations with logic and build towers out of air." He was right. The Renaissance was not an invention, it was architecture of thought. Painters began to test theology the way astronomers test stars. They wondered, if God is perfect, why would his world be flat? If creation is divine, shouldn't its beauty be measurable? Perspective was not blasphemy. It was devotion through understanding. In workshops, theology turned into trigonometry. Lines met at vanishing points, as prayers met in silence. A student of geometry remarked, "The eye is a pilgrim." And with that sentence, Renaissance vision became its own kind of worship. The city changed its perfume, incense faded, oil and iron took its place. The smell of industry, but also of inquiry. Scholars soaked parchment in vinegar to preserve it. Physicians boiled herbs at dawn. Metalsmiths mixed mercury and tin, seeking alchemy but finding chemistry. Even failure became noble. A miscast statue was not shame, but experiment. Florence had replaced certainty with curiosity, a quieter, humbler faith. In the workshop of a mapmaker, a circle slowly widened into a world. Coasts inked like size, mountains patient and precise. Rome had once drawn the limits of empire. Now Florence drew the limits of knowledge and found none. Sailors brought tales of far continents. Cartographers measured stories into lines, and in doing so they turned imagination into geography. The earth itself became a manuscript. Every voyage, a marginal note. No one thought of the empire anymore. The word had gone quiet. What replaced it was subtler, a network of ideas instead of provinces. Art traveled faster than armies. Books crossed borders no king could close. And through that invisible web, the Roman instinct for order, I learned to speak in the language of reason. The empire had ended, but its architecture, its will to connect, lived on in paper and paint. Florence had become the new capital of memory. Even as presses thundered, some still preferred the pen. Late at night, a scribe bent over vellum, copying Virgil one more time. He knew the printed text existed. He didn't care. He wrote for the sound of ink, for the slow choreography of letters appearing under light. When he finished, he closed the manuscript, sighed, and whispered, "Now it remembers me." Florence glowed after midnight. Candles in towers, lamps in windows, stars above the river's bend. The hum of presses never ceased. Somewhere, a poet rewrote Petrarch. Somewhere else, a girl learned to read. The city was awake but not restless. It was thinking. It was building something larger than walls, a bridge of awareness from past to possible. History loves names, but Florence was filled with anonymous visionaries. The mason who refined a curve until rainwater ran perfectly off. The typesetter who noticed that spacing changed comprehension. The apprentice who suggested that angels might stand barefoot on earth. Their names are lost, but their corrections remain. Civilization, in truth, is built by editors, the quiet kind. At dawn, the bells called again. But this time, they rang not for mass, for the morning. Workshops opened, dust danced in the light, and the city exhaled yesterday. Florence was no longer copying Rome. It was conversing with it. The dream of empire had become the discipline of creation. Every canvas, a treaty. Every book, a bridge. And over the Arno, the reflection of domes and clouds looked almost deliberate, as if the sky itself were designing. A beam entered through the workshop window and settled on a half-finished sketch. The lines met exactly at the vanishing point. The apprentice smiled. He didn't need to measure. The world for a moment aligned itself. He blew the dust away, and the drawing shone. Outside, the morning widened. Florence inhaled. The world turned the page. The light moved north with merchants, with friars on narrow paths, with students chasing rumors, manuscripts packed beside spices and wool, Greek letters pressed against trade goods. Every caravan was a library in motion. Over the Alps, across frozen passes, ideas traveled in satchels wrapped against snow. They reached cities that had never seen a dome or a fresco, yet were hungry for both. In Paris, professors unrolled scrolls and stared. In Oxford, scholars copied diagrams they didn't yet understand. The air itself felt different, as if reason had crossed a border. Europe began to draw itself again, not with boundaries, but with questions. Printing spread like rumor made solid. Presses thundered in Basel, Antwerp, Mainz. Every strike of this type was the heartbeat of civilization. Books became bridges. A printer in Venice could speak to a reader in Cologne. Ink was the first internet, slow, tangible, faithful. Margins filled with arguments and replies. Learning became a conversation that never slept. Even kings began to read. Knowledge no longer belonged only to the cloister. It belonged to anyone who asked patiently enough. Mathematicians sketched instruments beside looms. Clockmakers learned astronomy to keep better time. Painters studied anatomy until the human form obeyed. In Padua, a young student dissected by candlelight and saw order inside the body. In Krakow, Copernicus turned the sky itself upside down. Every discovery echoed the same belief, that the world was built on pattern, and that pattern could be understood. Venice traded in silk and glass, but also in knowledge. Sailors brought back more than cargo. They brought stories of strange constellations, of horizons wider than maps allowed. Cartographers spread parchment across their tables and redrew creation, longitude, latitude speculation. Each correction felt like a confession. The ocean was no longer mystery, it was geometry waiting for proof, and behind every chart stood the quiet inheritance of Rome, the instinct to measure, to order, to name. Alberti wrote that beauty was harmony made visible. His treatise became scripture for builders. Across Europe, cathedrals learned restraint. Walls grew lighter, arches cleaner, facades measured like sentences. Where Gothic once soared, Renaissance steadied. Balance replaced awe. A traveler could stand in Florence, Ferrara, or Bruges and feel the same calm pulse beneath the stone, a geometry of faith. Pico della Mirandola asked, "What man may choose his own place?" It was a question older than scripture and newer than dawn. He believed that freedom was sacred, that choice itself was divine. His words spread quietly, carried by students and pilgrims. They changed not politics first, but prayer. People began to speak to God as individuals again, not out of rebellion, but recognition. The Renaissance had given humanity back its mirror. Painters became scientists of vision. Leonardo tested the shadow as if it were substance. Michelangelo found motion in marble. Raphael balanced tenderness and law. Their works agreed on one truth, that the divine hides in detail. A fold of cloth could express theology. A hand resting on a book could hold an entire philosophy. Art had ceased to illustrate faith. It began to reveal it. And Europe, seeing itself reflected with such precision, learned both humility and wonder. Printing presses glowed through the night, their operators blackened with soot and purpose. Philosophy no longer waited for permission. It printed itself. Erasmus wrote of peace in a time of swords. Thomas More imagined justice on an island that didn't exist. Every book was an experiment in conscience. Disagreement became fertile. To argue was to refine. Silence now felt like neglect. Mathematicians gave the universe syntax, lines, angles, proofs, the sentences of certainty. Navigation improved, lenses sharpened, clocks learned precision. Galileo, still a boy, looked through a telescope and saw the heavens moving as Euclid would have drawn them. The dream of empire had found a new frontier, truth itself. And yet, behind every calculation, the same humility lingered. To know was not to own. It was to listen. Florence was no longer alone. Milan, Venice, Antwerp, and Nuremberg joined the chorus. Each city specialized in a kind of thought. Venice in printing, Nuremberg in instruments, Antwerp in trade, Paris in argument. Europe had become a republic of workshops. Ideas traveled faster than armies. Letters outran decrees. For the first time in centuries, civilization felt collaborative. Archaeologists began to dig with reverence. Columns unearthed, statues lifted from soil still smelling of empire. They brushed off centuries of silence and recognized themselves in the marble. Rome had not vanished, it had waited. Every ruin became a teacher, every inscription a conversation resumed. The past was no longer behind. It was beneath and rising. In London, stages filled with arguments disguised as play. In Florence, masks turned allegory into movement. In Madrid, poets measured honor in verse. Drama became philosophy's twin. Audiences left quieter than they arrived. Language learned to act. Emotions are learned to reason. And the human mind, newly aware of itself, became the central landscape of art. Scholars began to dream of connection. If nature followed laws, perhaps nations could too. Diplomats quoted Aristotle. Explorers read Ptolemy between storms. The world's divisions began to feel temporary, mere outlines on an unfinished map. For the first time, humanity imagined itself as one story. Fragmented, yes, but legible. Every awakening casts shadows. Printing spreads heresy as easily as wisdom. Curiosity unsettled doctrine. Faith had to learn patience. But even its defenders admitted that light could not be unlearned. Truth had changed from possession to pursuit. and pursuit required freedom. Florence had whispered it. Europe began to understand it. By the early 16th century, Europe had redrawn its own mind. Rome had ruled bodies, Byzantium had guarded souls, Florence had freed the intellect. The world was no longer an inheritance, it was a question. In studios, in classrooms, in ports and presses, humanity practiced thinking as if thought itself were a form of prayer. The Renaissance was ending, but its habit remained, to look closely, to ask quietly, to believe that understanding is sacred work. Evening again. The Arno mirrors the stars. The same current that carried Rome's dust now carries pages, pigments, and dreams. Florence sleeps, but her ideas keep traveling, north, west, into every tongue. The light that moved west has become thought itself, the shape of memory, the architecture of our reason. And as the night deepens, the world still glows faintly with that remembered dawn. The Renaissance did not begin as an invention. It began as remembrance. The same lines once carved into marble returned as sketches on parchment. The same geometry that measured temples now measured cathedrals. The same Latin that bound the empire whispered again in every university. Europe was not escaping Rome, it was translating her. Every scholar who opened a forgotten text, every artist who studied proportion, every mason who drew an arch was answering the same call, to remember what civilization once promised, that order and beauty could live in the same shape. In Florence and Venice, citizens debated policy in chambers modeled after the Roman Senate. The language of empire became the grammar of liberty. Cicero's words, copied for centuries in quiet monasteries, now guided men who ruled without kings. The Republic had returned, not in legions or lictors, but in discussion, in civic pride, in the belief that government itself was a moral art. To rule justly, one must first learn proportion. It was an idea born in the Forum, forgotten in the dark, and reborn under Tuscan light. When Brunelleschi studied the ruins, he saw not decay but instruction. He measured fallen columns as if reading scripture. He found in their ratios a rhythm too deliberate to die. From that rhythm he raised the dome, a Roman skeleton filled with Christian breath. Every brick turned upward like prayer and memory joined. Visitors said it felt ancient and new at once. It was. For the first time in 1,000 years, a city had spoken again in Rome's accent. Renaissance builders spoke Latin with mortar, their arches quoted the Colosseum. Their courtyards borrowed peace from the cloister, but balance from the basilica. They understood what Rome had always known, that a city teaches its citizens. Straight streets suggested the reason. Symmetry encouraged calm. Public squares reminded people to gather, to debate, to belong. Architecture became ethics. And in that ethics, the empire breathed again. While painters worked in color, scholars worked in ink. They opened Justinian's old codes, the bones of Roman order, and found them still living. Civil law, they realized, was not theology, it was mathematics applied to mercy. Universities copied the texts line by line. Students recited Latin clauses as if they were prayers of stability. From those pages, modern Europe learned how to reason with power. Empires might fall, but justice, once written clearly, has a way of surviving its authors. Princes hired secretaries trained in rhetoric, not war. Diplomacy became the empire's new frontier. Letters replaced spears. Ambassadors replaced generals. They wrote as Romans once spoke, measured, deliberate, believing that persuasion was stronger than conquest. In this age, a well-phrased sentence could move borders. A treaty could outlive an army. The empire had learned to speak softly, and found it more effective. Artists painted virtue the way philosophers once defined it. Temperance, justice, prudence, no longer abstract ideals, but human faces, Roman virtues reborn in oil and light. Sandro Botticelli's goddesses walked like statues come alive. Leonardo's faces carried the stillness of marble. Each work was not imitation, but I will continue. The Renaissance rediscovered the Roman secret, that beauty is moral clarity made visible. Where the medieval world had painted the soul, the Renaissance painted anatomy. The body became a map of divine design, flesh ordered like architecture, motion governed by geometry. Leonardo dissected as Vitruvius had measured, seeking proportion, harmony, truth. To study the body was to study Rome's oldest philosophy, that the universe was built in symmetry and man was its microcosm. Latin, long the language of monks, found its second wind. Humanists cleaned it of clutter, restored its cadence, and wrote as Cicero had written, not for God but for clarity. Letters, poems, treatises, all in that same balanced tongue. The Roman ear for elegance had returned to Europe's throat. Even nations that spoke other languages learned to think in Latin order. Grammar itself became a bridge to reason. Rome had once drawn roads, now men draw maps. Lines on parchment replaced stone highways, but served the same dream, to connect the world. Every compass, every astrolabe was a tribute to the Roman habit of precision. When explorers charted new continents, they named them with Latin roots, as if giving the earth back to the empire in spirit. Terra Nova, Australis Pacificus. The empire's tongue outlived its borders. By the 16th century, Rome had found its truest successor, not a nation, but a network. Writers and scholars across Europe exchanged letters filled with philosophy, art, experiment. They called themselves Republica Literarum, the Republic of Letters. They used Latin for common ground, reason for currency, and courtesy for law. It was an empire without armies, yet more enduring than any before it. Not everyone celebrated the return. Some saw in Rome's memory the seeds of pride. Kings feared that republics might rise again. Priests feared that reason might replace revelation. The same virtues that once built order now threatened authority. History, faithful to its pattern, had brought Rome's paradox back to life, that clarity always asks for freedom, and freedom always asks for courage. Still, the world moved forward, carrying its Roman tools: law, architecture, rhetoric, discipline. Even when new empires rose, Spain, France, England, each wore the old shapes like familiar armor. Their capitals are filled with columns, their charters quoted Latin. Their ambition borrowed the same vocabulary: unity, civility, peace. Rome no longer ruled, it resonated. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe looked different, but thought the same. Its cities echoed the forums, its laws, the 12 tables, its faith, the endurance of Byzantium. The Renaissance had not replaced Rome, it had completed her. The empire that once built in stone now built in mind and language. Its frontiers were no longer rivers and walls, but questions and ideas. Rome had survived her fall by teaching the world to remember. And in that remembrance she still lived, quiet, patient, unconquered. Rome had always divided itself in spirit, body and soul, law and faith, Caesar and Christ. The Middle Ages tried to choose between them. The Renaissance tried to hold both. But by the 16th century, the balance began to tremble again. The Church had inherited Rome's order, its courts, its language, its hierarchy. But its certainty met a new rival, the Roman habit of inquiry. Reason had returned home, and the empire's oldest argument, what is truth and who may define it, was about to begin again. In Rome, the popes ruled from marble palaces built on imperial foundations. Columns from pagan temples now framed Christian altars. Latin still filled the air, as if the empire had merely changed uniforms. The Vatican was the new capital, its artists the new legions. Raphael, Michelangelo, Bramante, all commanded by pontiffs who thought like emperors. They believed beauty could defend faith. That order could silence doubt. But outside their walls, a different Rome was stirring, one that whispered of reform and remembered the cost of pride. In distant cities, monks read the same texts the popes revered. They found the same Latin phrases, but heard them differently. Luther wrote his theses not in German first, but in the scholars' Latin of Cicero and Augustine. Even rebellion spoke Rome's tongue. When he argued that conscience outranked decree, he was echoing the old republic, the citizen's duty to truth above command. Reform, at its heart, was another Roman virtue, integrity before authority. Rome had taught that law is sacred only if it serves justice. The reformers turned that lesson inward. If the heart is Rome's smallest province, then conscience must be its governor. This was not heresy, it was inheritance. The Stoics had said the same, that the just man is a state unto himself. Now the idea returned, carved not in marble, but in spirit. And Europe, divided by faith, remained united in method, still reasoning as Rome had taught it to. Even as faith fractured, art remained loyal to structure. Michelangelo painted the Sistine ceiling like a chronicle of Roman strength. The prophets stood as senators of creation. Adam reached toward God with the poise of a sculpted Caesar. Power and proportion, the twin virtues of empire, still ruled the brush. The Church might dispute theology, but all sides agreed on geometry. From pulpits and courts, voices rose in the old cadence. Preachers thundered with Ciceronian rhythm. Lawyers defended the faith with clauses lifted from the forum. Even kings quoted Virgil in decrees. The Renaissance had given speech its discipline again. To argue was Roman, to persuade, divine. The Reformation, Counter-Reformation, and every debate between them were conducted in the empire's second language, rhetoric. Gutenberg's press became the new legion. Each page marched farther than any soldier. Rome's dream of a unified tongue found fulfillment in movable type. Latin bound scholars together, vernaculars bound nations. Pamphlets replaced edicts. Ideas traveled faster than obedience. For the first time since Augustus, words ruled the world. Exploration, too, spoke Latin. Navigators read Ptolemy as they charted new coasts. Ship logs quoted Roman measures. New worlds received Roman names. Regnum Hispania, Terra Nova, Oceanus Atlanticus. The empire's habit of naming was a way of claiming, but beneath it was admiration, a belief that to understand the world was to bring it into reason's order. Every map was a quiet oath to the same gods of geometry that once measured aqueducts. Kings studied Machiavelli in secret. His prince was not instruction in cruelty, but in consequence. He wrote like Livy, reasoning that power obeys laws of nature, not a miracle. His readers called him cynical, but he was simply Roman, observing men as they are, not as they claim to be. In him, the empire's old pragmatism returned, wearing a Florentine mask. The church answered doubt with architecture. The Council of Trent codified belief as Justinian once codified law. Precision replaced ambiguity. Faith became legislation. Cathedrals rose in spirals of certainty. Baroque curves taught obedience through awe. Even rebellion inspired clarity, Rome's eternal instinct to organize the storm. Rome had built highways for legions. The modern world built them for letters. Post routes crossed Europe like arteries of communication. Messengers carried treaties, books, discoveries. Each milestone echoed the old milestones of the Appian Way. Infrastructure had returned as intellect. To connect was Roman. To correspond was its evolution. In Basel, Paris, and Oxford, learned men formed councils of the mind. They debated medicine, astronomy, and ethics in rooms arranged like the Curia Julia. They voted by logic, not lineage. The Republic had survived in the seminar. They called it the Academy, but its spirit was senatorial, orderly disagreement in pursuit of truth. Rome had always balanced chaos with discipline. Now Europe tried the same. Reformers, humanists, Jesuits, kings, each believed they were restoring the right Rome. For some, it was the Rome of saints. For others, the Rome of philosophers. Each built upon the same foundations, argued in the same structures, and sought the same end, a world that made sense. By the late 16th century, the world stood at a precipice familiar to history. Reason had rebuilt confidence. Faith demanded humility. The two empires, of Caesar and of Christ, looked at one another again, as if meeting after exile. Neither could destroy the other. They were halves of the same inheritance. Rome had always been both, and the balance she once sought had become the balance of the world. Rome had once believed the world finite, a circle of known shores. Now, ships cut across an ocean no map could contain. Compass and quadrant replaced spear and shield, but the purpose was familiar: to reach, to name, to bring order. Sailors traced invisible roads on water like legions marching through mist. Every harbor built a forum, every colony raised a column. The empire had changed its element. The stone had become a sail. Explorers prayed in Latin before departure. Their ships bore Roman names: Santa Maria, Regina, Victoria. In their logs they wrote distances in miles, not leagues. They measured stars with Ptolemy's tables and trusted the calendar of Julius Caesar to tell them when to return home. Rome guided them still, quietly, through arithmetic and ritual. Even discovery spoke her language. Mapmakers spread their sheets like generals unfolding campaigns. Meridians became new frontiers. Lines of longitude replaced borders of stone. Every continent entered the Roman imagination: Terra Australis, Mare Pacificum, Nova Roma. Latin made the unknown pronounceable. Naming was a kind of possession, but also a confession of wonder. Through ink, Rome redrew the earth. In Lisbon and Seville, in London and Amsterdam, new empires rose, each claiming to be chosen, each quoting Rome to justify itself. Senates met beside thrones. Law traveled with conquest. Architects raised domes on distant shores. When Spain planted its flag in the Americas, its chroniclers called the city they built New Rome. When England drafted charters, it used the language of the Republic: consuls, citizens, commonwealth. The world was becoming Roman by imitation, and imitation, as always, was a kind of memory. Missionaries carried crosses where legions once carried standards. They preached in Latin rhythm, translated scripture into local tongues as Rome had once translated gods. Their churches rose on classical plans, naves like basilicas, apses like tribunals. The gospel traveled the same routes as trade. Faith followed empire, but order followed faith. Rome's architecture had become theology again. In cities newly wealthy from oceans, scholars returned to Rome's quieter legacy, the art of thought. They built academies instead of arenas, observatories instead of forts. Galileo measured the sky with Roman patience. Descartes reasoned like a senator drafting logic into law. To understand was the new conquest. The frontier had moved inward into the mind itself. Rome had dreamed of dominion. Her descendants dreamed of comprehension. Where the ancients built arches, the moderns built mechanisms. Every gear a column, every pendulum is an aqueduct of time. Engineers spoke Latin without knowing it, axis, radius, centrum, tempus. They had inherited the empire's vocabulary of precision. Even machines obeyed Roman grammar. The order that once held provinces now held seconds. Empires collapsed, but Roman law remained. Merchants in Amsterdam settled disputes using clauses copied from Justinian's code. French jurists built entire systems on the 12 tables. Even across the Atlantic, new republics quoted Latin maxims in their constitutions. A city had died, its logic had not. Rome had become a method, a way of making fairness last. When revolution came to the New World, its architects looked backward for guidance. They studied Cicero and Polybius. They imagined virtue and balance, senate and people, liberty and law. Their buildings bore pediments and pillars. Their speeches borrowed cadence from the Forum. They called their experiment a republic, and on its first seal they engraved a Roman goddess, Libertas. The empire had crossed the sea again, this time as an ideal. Back in Europe, artists returned to antiquity as if seeking absolution. Canova sculpted calm like an apology to chaos. Painters filled galleries with the poise of old statues. Napoleon, marching through Italy, carried both sword and surveyor. He measured ruins while claiming empire. Even ambition needed precedent, and only Rome provided one vast enough. On the slopes of Vesuvius, excavators uncovered Pompeii. Streets, frescoes, bread left in ovens, the everyday life of empire preserved like a memory too stubborn to fade. Europe looked into those ashes and saw itself. Cities, pleasures, fragility. Archaeology became an autobiography. The living world met its ancestor and recognized the resemblance. By the 18th century, Rome existed everywhere but Rome. In Parisian salons, in London's law courts, in Washington's columns. Poets compared their nations to hers. Historians warned of her fate. Architects rebuilt her skyline in every capital. The empire had turned inside out, no longer territory, but influence. Her ruins were her ambassadors. Even those who rejected empire spoke with her discipline. Revolutionaries quoted Republican Rome. Scientists adopted her vocabulary of order. Philosophers borrowed her skepticism, her patience with paradox. Rome had become the skeleton of modernity. Invisible, indispensable, not in marble, nor in armies, but in the mind. Her ideals, reason, proportion, law, spread through continents as naturally as sunlight through open windows. Wherever people built with symmetry, argued with courtesy, or sought justice in written words, she existed. The empire reborn was not Rome restored, but Rome remembered, its memory acting quietly within us all. Evening again. Across the old world and the new, cities glowed like constellations. Their streets still followed the logic of the Cardo and Decumanus. Their plazas still echoed the Forum's geometry. Their citizens still spoke of rights, of laws, of peace through structure. Rome had never left. She had only learned to travel, and the light that moved west. The same light born beside the Tiber now circled the entire earth, a halo of reason around the night. The modern world looked into glass and saw Rome, not in ruin, but in rhythm. Capitals stood on 7 hills again, London, Paris, Washington, each with domes and forums, each claiming inheritance. Marble turned to masonry, aqueduct to railway, legion to law. The forms had changed, the instinct had not. Every nation that organized itself was speaking Latin in action, even when the tongue was long forgotten. Smoke replaced incense, steel replaced marble, but the geometry remained. Bridges spanned valleys with the confidence of arches reborn. Factories repeated the logic of basilicas, columns of iron, vaults of glass, clerestories of light. Engineers were Rome's new architects, their blueprints her descendants. They did not build for gods, but for order. And order had always been divine enough. Republics multiplied. Constitutions quoted Latin unseen. Senatus, populus, lex, civitas. The citizen became sacred again, a being of rights and duties, protected not by emperor but by principle. Courts wore togas in spirit if not in cloth. Their columns testified to an idea too resilient to die, that justice is the true frontier of civilization. Amid machines and noise, philosophy rediscovered calm. Men and women read Seneca to survive cities louder than battlefields. They found peace not in temples but in temperance. The old counsel, control what you can, endure what you must, fit factories as well as forums. Rome's inner empire, the one ruled by discipline, was proving timeless. Where once Rome built roads, now nations have built schools. Children marched beneath lintels instead of arches, but learned the same structure: grammar before speech, logic before persuasion, duty before reward. Latin lingered in mottos and maxims, quietly shaping mouths that spoke other tongues. Knowledge has become the new citizenship, literacy the new legion. Trade crossed oceans, diplomats met in congresses. They called it international law, but its bones were Roman. Pacta sunt servanda, res publica, jus gentium. Treaties echoed Justinian's precision. Even rivals agreed that reason must govern rivalry. The world had learned to argue instead of conquer. Rome's final lesson, understood at last. But every empire casts its own eclipse. Industrial wealth bred appetite. Nations built fleets and painted maps in color and claim. They called their empires modern, yet all wore the old laurel in disguise. From Delhi to Dakar, roads ran straight as the Appian. From Cairo to Canberra, courthouses stood on Corinthian columns. Rome's reflection stretched until it fractured. Machines age faster than marble. Smoke blackened what once gleamed. Wars consumed the order they had built. Europe burned, once for theology, now for ideology. And amid the flames, its leaders quoted Rome again, of republics lost, of emperors risen, of lessons ignored. The empire had taught endurance. Humanity was still learning humility. After the wars, nations gathered in assemblies without swords. They called it a league, then a union, but its spirit was Senate reborn. Delegates argued in chambers shaped like amphitheaters. Translators whispered in every tongue, yet the debate was the same as ever. Order versus freedom, unity versus pride. Rome's ghost presided quietly, hands folded in patience. The street became the new rostrum. Voices rose not from marble steps but from microphones. Citizens still pleaded for justice, still quoted reason, still appealed to a law higher than might. Every protest, every parliament, every courthouse doorway was another echo of the forum. The stones had changed, the arguments had not. Archaeologists, historians, filmmakers, each rebuilt the empire in their medium. Ruins became museums, myths became studies, the past became a curriculum. Remembering has become a profession. Rome's greatest monument was no longer her buildings, but her documentation. She existed wherever curiosity was honest. Then came circuits instead of roads, light instead of stone. Data flowed like soldiers once marched, disciplined, numbered, ceaseless. Networks spanned continents as aqueducts once spanned valleys. Information replaced conquest. The empire had dematerialized, but its pattern persisted. Connection, communication, control. The Roman grid had gone global. Programmers wrote code as jurists once wrote law, in logic, in clauses, in pursuit of reliability. Algorithms were the new edicts, errors, the new rebellions. And behind every rule set stood the same ideal, that structure can civilize chaos. Rome's spirit was not nostalgic, it had simply updated its syntax. Look at any skyline. The pillars are steel now, but they rise in a rhythm known for 2,000 years. Listen to any courtroom and Latin still hums beneath translation. Watch any senate and the procedure still follows the forum's choreography. Rome survives in function, not appearance. In the way the world keeps itself coherent. Every spreadsheet, every contract, every city plan, a quiet continuation of the old design. Night settles on the modern world. Screens glow where torches once burned. Voices cross oceans instantly, yet speak of the same hopes: justice, peace, belonging. The empire never ended. It dispersed into everyone who reasons, builds, or remembers. Rome became humanity's handwriting, the style of thought we all inherit. And somewhere beneath traffic and signal, her ancient rhythm still beats. measure before motion, purpose before pride, order before rest. Rome had always been more than walls. It was a way of arranging the world and ourselves so that chaos felt temporary. Long after her borders faded, her order stayed lodged in the human mind. A road drawn straight, a column spaced in rhythm, a sentence measured for balance. Each was an unconscious memory. Civilization became the echo of that memory, a promise whispered from the ruins to every age that followed. Latin slipped quietly through centuries. Even as tongues changed, its bones held their shape. Doctors used it to name the body, lawyers to argue precision, scholars to define the soul. It was the empire's second heartbeat, steady, invisible, circulating through every discipline. Even now, when we speak of time, of gravity, of justice, we speak in her syllables. To think clearly is still to think a little like a Roman. The alphabet marched westward too, its letters uniform as legions. Every child who learns to write traces the same forms carved in stone 2 millennia ago. The line from A to Z is a road older than nations. The curved R of the Republic, the angled M of Mars, the calm O of Omnia. They survive like fossils of thought, carried in every signature. Rome's handwriting became humanity's. Artists never stopped conversing with her. Painters copied ruins to study proportion. Sculptors touched cracked marble as if greeting an ancestor. Even abstraction owes her debt: geometry, discipline, restraint. The empire taught that form matters, that beauty is not decoration, but comprehension made visible. A modern gallery is a forum of color, a cathedral of structure. Each composition, a descendant of her clarity. Theater, too, carried her breath. Actors still enter from right and left as Romans once entered the stage from the doors of the domus and the street. The chorus still speaks in unison, a civic conscience reminding the crowd. Comedy and tragedy remain the twin masks of human order and error, as old as Plautus, as current as today. In every performance, the Republic gathers again, audience as Senate, drama as debate. Our calendars still obey Caesar. The months march in his cadence: January for beginnings, March for motion, July and August for emperors who would not be forgotten. Leap years, weeks, and names of seasons, all legacies of administration. We do not think of Rome when we mark appointments or anniversaries. Yet every page turned is a continuation of her schedule. Time itself remains her most obedient subject. Archaeologists dig where poets once prayed. They recover not just stones but intentions. A piece of tile tells of heating systems, a coin of taxation, a mosaic of leisure. Each fragment says, "We were organized." Excavation is not curiosity alone, it is recognition. We dig for ourselves for proof that once triumphed over ruin and can do so again. Every empire that followed saw its reflection in hers. Spain dreamed of destiny, France of grandeur, Britain of roads without end. All borrowed her symbols, her laurels, her certainty. Each believed they were finishing her story. But the lesson they missed was the one her ruins whisper, that permanence is not possession, but participation. Rome does not belong to conquerors, it belongs to continuity. In quiet libraries, scholars still argue with her ghosts. They translate Livy to understand politics, Cicero to learn sincerity, Tacitus to detect corruption. History becomes correspondence. The past answers, if questioned precisely enough. Rome's writers remain companions, not relics, minds preserved in amber, still instructing their inheritors. Walk through any modern capital at dusk, and her shape emerges, straight avenues meeting in circles, arches announcing gateways, public squares designed for gathering, not hiding. Even glass towers respect the grid. Beneath their reflections lies the same geometry of trust. To build coherently is to confess descent. Rome's final transformation was subtle. Her gods faded, her shrines crumbled, but her reverence remained, redirected from Olympus to obligation. Citizenship became sacred, law replaced liturgy, service stood where sacrifice once did. The modern world, though secular in form, still kneels before the altar of order. We call it society. She would have called it duty. Even decline carries her pattern. When cities falter, they do so theatrically, as she once did. Economies unravel like legions in retreat. Senators argue past resolutions. Crowds seek spectacle instead of substance. And always, somewhere, a voice repeats her warning that civilization is not an inheritance, but a rehearsal was performed every generation. Tourists follow the routes of pilgrims now. Their relics are ruins, their prayers photographs. Yet even this is devotion of a kind. They walk where the stones still hold warmth, where arches hum faintly with history. To stand in the Forum at twilight is to hear language without words, the hum of continuity itself. Each generation must rediscover her, as one rediscovers a melody by listening instead of playing. Artists reinterpret, teachers translate, citizens rebuild. Her legacy is not a monument, but a method, to face complexity with structure and fate with composure. Rome gathered the world once by conquest, now by memory. Her influence is a mosaic of countless hands: African engineers, Greek philosophers, Asian traders, Celtic masons. Every border she touched contributed a color. Every language she heard became part of the pattern. The empire's endurance lies in that inclusiveness, a design large enough for contradiction. Even night cannot erase her. It glows through architecture, through principle, through the calm persistence of planning. Each generation adds a tile, a law, a bridge, a line of code, extensions of the same intent to make the world intelligible. The light of Rome does not fade with empires. It adjusts its wavelength to whatever age receives it, sometimes bronze, sometimes marble, sometimes screen, always structured, always continuity. And as we look upon her now, not as citizens or subjects, but as heirs, we see what she truly built. Not a city, but a civilization's memory of itself. Her lasting light is the measure we still use to see who we are and how far we have yet to go. Civilizations rise like suns and set again, but some stars do not disappear, they simply shine from farther away. Rome became that distant light, no longer seen in conquest, but felt in alignment. Everywhere order endures, she exists. Everywhere reason outlives rage, she speaks. The circle she drew around the Mediterranean was never meant to close. It was meant to expand until it became the outline of the world. The ruins are not reminders of loss. They are instructions in endurance. Touch a column, and it answers in temperature, in patience, in silence, shaped by centuries. The mortar may crumble, but the measurement remains exact. To walk among them is to feel how thought becomes material, how faith becomes proportion. Every fallen arch is an unfinished sentence. We continue writing. Rome's greatest invention was not empire, it was participation. The idea that belonging is built, that duty defines identity. Modern citizens, arguing, voting, dissenting, repairing, are still standing in her forum. They repeat the ritual she began: to disagree within structure, to seek progress without anarchy, to build arguments into architecture. The dream persists whenever people choose reason over rage. Rome taught faith without fanaticism, not in gods alone, but in process. That truth can be discovered, tested, agreed upon. Science, jurisprudence, governance, all stem from that quiet conviction that the universe prefers order. Each experiment, each verdict, each policy argued into balance is an act of devotion to that secular sanctity. Listen closely. The world still hums in her pitch. The pulse of traffic through grids of streets, the rhythm of speeches in measured clauses, the discipline of bridges holding under weight, all sound like Rome. Even the silence between nations when they sign instead of strike is her music. Yet every light needs a shadow to define it. Rome's arrogance is caution written largely. She teaches power to count its days, teaches pride that progress requires humility. Her fall was not failure, but feedback. Every time humanity builds too fast, her story pauses us, reminds us that the strongest structure is moral, not material. There is no single heir to Rome, not a nation, not a church, not a city. Her descendants are plural and unseen: teachers, builders, writers, jurists, anyone who values clarity more than noise. The Roman Empire ended. The Roman temperament did not. It lives wherever patience outlasts chaos. Future civilizations will quote her without realizing it. They will build habitats on other worlds with corridors and courtyards, laws and ledgers, forums of light instead of stone. Their calendars will still be hers, their measurements, their metaphors. Even in silence between stars, Latin will echo in the structure of thought. Rome was never geography, it was geometry. And still, on the banks of the Tiber, the stones remain. Evening settles on the ruins like approval. Bells fold into dusk, fountains murmur Latin lullabies. Tourists drift away, cats patrol the Colosseum as if guarding eternity. Above it all, the moon, another ancient witness, washes marble into memory. 2,500 years of weather have failed to erase proportion. The city endures not because it resists time, but because it understands it. From the curve of a bridge to the cadence of a constitution, her design repeats. Order, freedom, excess, reflection, order. The rhythm of every age. Rome's genius was to see pattern and call it peace. Her mercy was to fail so that we might learn gentler repetitions. In myth, Vesta's flame kept the city alive. Today, it burns in quieter places, in classrooms, in courts, in studios, in the minds of those who still believe that structure can protect beauty. The flame has changed fuel but not purpose. It warms thought, not stone. The Tiber reflects lights from modern bridges, each one a lineage. Water flows past fragments of empire, the way time flows through us, steady, forgiving, reflective. Stand by that river at night, and you feel the truth beneath the centuries, that Rome was never about dominance. It was about endurance through design. And endurance, finally, is another word for love. So the story rests here, not ended, but paused between breaths. The empire that outlived itself has become a pulse within humanity. Every act of reason, every bridge of understanding, every law that bends toward mercy is her continuation. Rome is not past tense. She is a grammar student for the future. The light that moved west now moves everywhere, through circuits and skies, through thought and memory. It touches faces who will never see her ruins, but live by her rhythm. And perhaps that is immortality's truest form, to become function instead of monument, to endure as the shape of thought itself. The empire sleeps, but the civilization dreams on, calmly, coherently, forever Roman. When the world awoke from war and plague, it found itself holding a mirror. Inside it shone the same old light, ordered, skeptical, serene. Rome's reason had returned, reforged in modern thought. Philosophers spoke like senators reborn, testing power with argument, faith with curiosity, hope with geometry. They called it enlightenment, but it was simply the empire's intellect speaking through new tongues. In Paris, in Berlin, in London, men gathered to codify the age. They drafted constitutions with the same precision as engineers. They debated justice as Romans had debated virtue, calmly, rhetorically, publicly. Montesquieu studied the balance of powers and saw the Senate in its shadow. Voltaire mocked emperors with the wit of Cicero, reborn. Jefferson copied the format of Livy to tell the story of a republic's birth. Liberty, once whispered in forums, now printed itself into nations. Mathematics, politics, and art followed the same grammar of symmetry. Newton measured gravity with the patience of a surveyor mapping roads. Locke described the mind as a city of rooms and corridors. Even music turned classical, its compositions built like temples of sound. The Enlightenment was not rebellion, it was renovated. Rome's skeleton was showing through again, a structure rediscovered, polished, admired. In ateliers and academies, painters copied antiquity until imitation became introspection. David's figures stood like statues learning motion. They fought, posed, deliberated as if aware of their heritage. The reason for painting was to honor Rome. To draw proportion was to remember her creed, that harmony is the most persuasive argument. Even revolution borrowed her posture, citizens in togas, oaths sworn beside columns. The past lent its dignity to the future. But reason alone could not sustain wonder. Beneath marble symmetry, emotion gathered heat. The Romantics rose like the empire's heart reclaiming its voice. They wandered ruins, wept over fallen stones, saw in decay a beauty beyond design. If the Enlightenment was Rome's intellect reborn, Romanticism was her soul rediscovered. The same melancholy, the same awe before mortality, the same longing for meaning beyond measure. Byron rode through Greece like a pilgrim seeking his ancestors. Shelley wrote of Ozymandias and meant himself. Goethe visited the Colosseum at dusk and heard philosophy echoing under ivy. They turned fragments into metaphors, stones into sentences. To feel deeply, they believed, was another form of remembering. And through their verses, Rome's emotional architecture survived, arches of grief, columns of courage, vaults of yearning. Reason questioned belief, faith answered with reflection. Rome's church, older than its empire, adapted again. It studied science, learned humility, and rebuilt cathedrals not as dominion but as dialogue. Baroque grandeur gave way to neoclassical calm. Priests preached of conscience, not command. The Vatican, once fortress, became a museum of continuity. Its art, the memory of power, transformed into patience. Universities multiplied like provinces, each one a miniature empire of the mind. Libraries became forums, lecture halls their senates. Students debated as tribunes once had, arguing truth into clarity. Degrees replaced triumphs, discovery replaced conquest. And through it all, the Roman principle remained. That structure sustains freedom. Steam replaced speech. But factories, too, followed Roman geometry. Pillars of iron, arches of glass, order born from repetition. The modern worker moved through rhythm, as legionaries once had. Cities swelled around chimneys as they had once gathered around columns. Public parks replaced forums, railways, and roads. The empire's layout had simply changed material. Across continents, intellectuals exchanged letters the way merchants once traded spices. Their words crossed oceans on paper ships. They debated politics, philosophy, art, each seeking a universal language. Latin was gone, but its structure endured in logic, its cadence in diplomacy. The Republic of Letters had matured into a Republic of Humanity, yet even reason casts conquest. Europe, proud of its enlightenment, looked outward again. Colonies replaced provinces. Exploration turned to administration. They built railways across continents, governments in marble, laws in Latin phrases. It was imitation wearing ambition. Rome's pattern repeated, magnificent, inevitable, fragile. When Paris raised the Arc de Triomphe, it was not a monument to victory, but to memory. Napoleon saw himself as Caesar revived, but his sculptors understood the irony. Empires cannot be resurrected, only reenacted. The arch stood waiting for time's verdict. Centuries later, traffic circles it like history repeating, motion around stillness, a lesson in rotation. Science advanced with imperial confidence. Telescopes replaced watchtowers, microscopes replaced sentinels, yet each discovery reminded humanity how vast the unknown remained. Even the age of reason ended in reverence for the cosmos, for the atom, for the structure beneath all things. The same structure Rome sensed in order, now proven in equations. Through revolutions and reforms, Rome's humanism endured, that the individual, not the institution, is the smallest and highest unit of civilization. Writers and teachers carried it quietly. They quoted Seneca to children, taught virtue as discipline, courage as clarity. Empires fell again, but character once taught outlives flags. By the 19th century's end, the world looked backward with gratitude. Museums filled with fragments, scholars filled with questions. History had become mirror, and Rome the reflection within it. Her story no longer belonged to power, but to perspective, to the understanding that endurance is the rarest art of all. The light she kindled had learned gentleness. It no longer demanded obedience, it invited thought, and thought, as ever, was her truest empire. By the dawn of the 20th century, the empire existed only in thought, but thought, Rome had proven, is harder to conquer than land. Her laws governed classrooms, her logic structured science, her virtues, discipline, clarity, measure, became the habits of civilization. The modern world moved faster, but it still marched in formation. Railways replaced roads, wires replaced messengers, but the routes were Roman in spirit, straight, ordered, purposeful. Museums rose like new forums. Instead of senators, they held memories. Stone heads from Greece, vases from Pompeii, scrolls unrolled under glass. Each display was a quiet oath, to preserve what time would otherwise erase. Curators became priests of remembrance. Their liturgy was cataloging, their faith chronology. Rome had built temples to gods, modernity built temples to continuity. Even governments spoke in her syntax. Senates sat in semicircles. Courthouses echoed basilicas. Every republic repeated the cadence of the forum. Diplomats quoted Latin to bless treaties. Scholars argued in Latinized French, philosophers in Latinized German. The words changed, the logic did not. A contract, a code, a constitution, each was Rome rewritten. Every law that balanced right and mercy was another translation of her moral geometry. Painters turned to her for gravity, writers for cadence, composers for structure. In symphonies and novels, you could hear her order breathing, theme and counter-theme, cause and consequence. The romantic storms subsided into classic calm. Art had learned from her how to last, by rhythm, by restraint, by returning to form when passion fades. Students filled academies modeled on her schools. They learned ethics before liberty, discipline before expression. Teachers taught that beauty was measurable, that even imagination required scaffolding. Every ruler drawn in a classroom echoed her architecture. Every essay argued like Cicero. Through education, Rome conquered gently, not with armies but with order. Urban planners became theologians of proportion. Boulevards radiated like spokes of an imperial wheel. Squares opened like courtyards of reason. Every fountain and facade spoke her old language of balance. When cities rebuilt after war, they returned instinctively to her geometry. Straight streets first, then water, then law. Rome's plan had become instinct. Humanity built coherence because coherence felt like home. But the industry's rhythm was harsher than marble. The machine age tested patience, tested proportion. Cities swelled too quickly, smoked too darkly. The Roman ideal of moderation shrank beneath acceleration. Yet even in factories, foremen quoted her virtues: discipline, hierarchy, endurance. Every assembly line was a legion reimagined, efficiency as ethos, order as salvation. Then came the wars. The old world turned its logic inward, and reason became machinery of ruin. Tanks crossed fields like armored legions. Columns collapsed under modern thunder. In the aftermath, Europe lay silent, a continent of ruins upon ruins. For the second time, Rome's descendants looked upon destruction and wondered if civilization itself could survive its own brilliance. They did what she had taught them. They rebuilt. Streets realigned, courts reopened. Children studied Latin in the mornings and learned to believe in structure again. Out of rubble rose symmetry once more. The same geometry that had outlived Caesar outlived the century's tyrants. It was not nostalgia, it was a necessity. After the wars, nations met to form assemblies of peace. They spoke of law between peoples, commerce without conquest, union without uniformity. Their flag bore stars instead of eagles, but the meaning was the same: diversity held together by order. Rome's dream had changed costume, an empire of cooperation instead of command. She had taught the world that strength requires symmetry. Airlines replaced legions. Trade networks replaced tribute. Information began to flow as water once had along her aqueducts. Every flight path, every fiber optic line traced the same principle: connection over chaos. Humanity no longer built empires of land. It built empires of linkages, and in those invisible lines the old design lived on. Even amid global change, law remained her voice. Courts gathered in The Hague to speak for the voiceless. They quoted ancient principles: that guilt requires proof, that cruelty negates authority. These were not modern ideas. They were Roman sentences spoken in a modern accent. To seek justice beyond vengeance was her highest teaching, and the world, after centuries of trial, I was beginning to learn it. As physics probed the universe, its thinkers found order at every scale, laws that echoed Justinian's dream of clarity. Einstein spoke of relativity in sentences as balanced as Stoic aphorisms. Curie pursued knowledge with the same devotion that built aqueducts. Science, like empire, was another attempt to comprehend pattern, a faith in the coherence of existence. Rome's instinct to organize the unknown had become the scientist's vocation. The 20th century ended not with conquest, but with curation. Museums grew, archives multiplied, recordings preserved every whisper. The impulse to document was the empire's instinct translated to technology. To record is to rule time. To preserve is to defy oblivion. Rome had sought eternity through stone. We seek it through storage. Look around any modern room, its symmetry, its measured light, its reasoned quiet, and you see her. She lives in the architecture of our minds, the manners of our arguments, the schedules of our days. We no longer call her by name, but we speak her dialect of order. Rome was never only a civilization. She was a disciplined person. And discipline, once learned, cannot die. The world she shaped has become her heir. Every balanced law, every deliberate bridge, every gentle sentence of structure is proof that her inheritance endures. The empire became humanity itself. The empire is no longer seen. It is felt, a pattern of conduct, a cadence of thought. Every court that balances reason and mercy, every bridge that connects strangers, every classroom where order and wonder coexist, these are her provinces now. Rome's roads have turned to circuits, her aqueducts to data streams, her legions to lines of dialogue crossing the world without armor. No banners, no borders, only rhythm, only the quiet persistence of structure. It begins with the simple instinct to organize: a city, a schedule, a law, a design. The same desire that once paved Italy now paves understanding. We straighten chaos, we measure the infinite. Rome's spirit whispers behind the instinct: clarity is compassion. Every plan that gives shelter, every law that limits cruelty is her philosophy alive again. The modern citizen carries a passport, not a birthright. Borders may separate governments, but customs, manners, even virtues trace a common ancestor. Politeness, discipline, fairness, all speak with her accent. When strangers meet in airports and obey a shared sequence of steps, line, passport, security, courtesy, they enact her logic. The choreography of civilization is Roman at its core, individuals moving in harmony without needing command. No one speaks Latin now, yet every language leans upon it. Half the world's tongues carry her roots like quiet fossils. From justice to virtue, from memory to empire, from aqua to terra to lumen, her vocabulary shapes our reality. Even in languages far from Europe, her loanwords travel with trade and technology. Science writes equations in her syntax. Medicine names its miracles in her terms. Law frames its sentences with her precision. Latin became not a language, but the software of reason. Modern skylines echo her ambition. Glass towers stand on grids once traced in sand. Domes evolved into observatories, forums into parliaments, temples into museums of design. Each floor plan speaks the same grammar: axis, symmetry, proportion, grace. Engineers may think themselves pragmatic, but in truth, they are poets in her lineage, writing stanzas in steel. Progress, for all its noise, still moves to the tempo she composed. Rome's roads sought to understand the earth. Modern science seeks to understand the universe. Both are acts of faith in order. Astronomers chart galaxies with the same discipline once used to chart provinces. Physicists describe matter with the same syntax of clarity. Where her engineers mastered gravity in arches, her descendants mastered it in orbit. A satellite circling Earth is another Roman road, paved in equations instead of stone. Rome taught that law was reason without passion. The modern world has tried to add compassion back in. Human rights are her philosophy, translated into universal form. The right to trial, the dignity of labor, the sanctity of citizenship, all are her ideas purified of empire, refined by centuries of conscience. Each clause written in the ink of empathy is still signed, silently, in her hand. The internet is her newest republic. Millions of citizens, millions of voices, all speaking at once, all bound by unseen laws of design. Servers are the new senates, moderation of the new magistrate. Every rule of conduct, every guideline against chaos is her echo. She survives in algorithms that seek fairness, in architectures that seek balance. Rome's civic dream transposed into code. Scroll through any screen and you see her instinct alive. Public discourse, argument, spectacle, persuasion. The memes, the manifestos, the debates, they're the same energy that filled the forum. Only the marble has changed to glass. In every post, a senator's speech, a citizen's plea, a philosopher's paradox. Humanity remains theatrical. Rome taught us how to perform thought. Once the empire was ruled by fear, now connection rules by empathy. Cameras bring strangers' lives into view. Charities cross oceans as easily as legions once marched. Hospitals and aid agencies replace the old provincial governors. The Pax Romana sought peace through control. Pax Humana seeks peace through understanding. And yet it follows her pattern: roads of connection, laws of conduct, a faith in structure over impulse. Nations still build capitals as if she might visit. Washington, Paris, Brasilia, Canberra, each a meditation on her geometry. Even superpowers speak her idiom: republic, senate, citizen, constitution. The costumes differ, the choreography does not. Every parliament is a modern forum, every diplomat a Roman rhetorician with different inflections. Power learned poise from her. Philosophy once debated gods, now it debates machines. But the method remains: thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the dialectic she adored. Thinkers of the digital age quote Seneca without realizing it: patience, temperance, the ethics of limitation. The Stoic returns each time the world grows loud. And in that calm resistance her wisdom breathes anew. Cinema, literature, architecture, each retells her myths in disguise. The hero's journey, the tragedy of power, the comedy of human folly, all carry her fingerprints. When modern filmmakers frame a face in symmetry, they borrow her sense of dignity. When writers build societies from scratch, they echo her architects. Even science fiction imagines its galaxies as empires that rise and fall in the same familiar rhythm. Rome's story has become the default dream of civilization. There is no capital now, no senate, no emperor, and yet the world moves in Roman logic. Traffic flows in lanes, currencies in decimals, justice in procedure. Every system that prefers pattern to chaos is her descendant. She endures not in rule, but in reliability. Memory itself is Roman. Our calendars, archives, monuments, data, all born from her desire to preserve. When we photograph, we replicate her mosaics. When we store, we echo her census. When we curate, we follow her archivists of marble and wax. To remember is to govern time, and Rome remains its governor still. Perhaps that is her final transformation, not the empire that rules us, but the one that reminds us what rule requires. She exists as mirror, not master. Each age looks into her history and sees its own reflection, its pride, its design, its flaw. Her ruins are the conscience of progress. They whisper, build beautifully, but build humbly. Beyond Earth, the light continues westward still, beyond orbit, beyond the reach of ruins. When humans leave for other worlds, they will bring her geometry with them. Domes for air, columns for balance, law for coexistence. Mars will have its forums, moons will have their senates. The instinct to order will travel with us, unchanged. Rome will rise again whenever humanity needs coherence, not of land, not of armies, but of understanding. It stretches across thought and time, held together by reason, sustained by design. Its citizens are thinkers, its rulers ideas. Its borders expand each time someone chooses structure over chaos, dialogue over silence, clarity over confusion. Rome's empire lives, quiet, radiant, written not on maps but within the architecture of the mind. Night falls on the modern world. The lights of cities trace constellations resembling old roads. In their glow, you can almost see legions of data marching, columns of memory rising, arches of progress gleaming faintly through mist. The empire never ended. It evolved. And as long as humanity values proportion, law, and light, as long as we find peace in the calm repetition of order, Rome will not be gone. She will simply be unnamed everywhere, eternal. The world has circled itself into mourning again. Skylines shimmer where mountains once stood, and satellites hum where legions marched. Yet the pattern is familiar. Beneath the noise of engines and algorithms, a quiet rhythm persists, the same proportion, the same patience, the same will to shape chaos into coherence. Rome no longer casts shadows. She provides alignment. Her empire has become sunrise, diffuse, gentle, illuminating rather than commanding. We live as Romans without knowing it. We structure our days by hours they named, measure our world with units they defined, govern our conduct by principles they refined. The devices in our hands, the calendars on our walls, the order in our laws, all are her language spoken through glass and code. We do not quote Cicero, but we argue like him. We do not salute the Senate, but we assemble in its shape, in councils, committees, networks. The inheritance continues not by memory, but by instinct. Civilization became habit, and the habit became Rome. Every age builds differently. Theirs in marble, ours in signal. Yet even silence follows her design. A quiet room, a calm interface, a moment of pause, each is symmetry rediscovered. Minimalism, that modern creed, is stoicism reborn in aesthetic form. Discipline, restraint, the removal of excess. We call it simplicity. Rome would have called it virtue. The digital world is loud, but its foundations are rational. Code is law written in light. Systems, protocols, algorithms, all are governed by logic older than electricity. The Republic has moved inside our machines. Every app a province, every user a citizen, every rule a clause of the unseen Senate. Moderation replaces magistrate, policy replaces decree. Debate continues, faster, noisier, but built on the same civic instinct. Rome's voice persists in the architecture of connection. Somewhere, a programmer writes an elegant loop and feels satisfaction. It is the same peace Vitruvius felt when geometry is aligned. Clarity brings calm. Order feels like grace. Logic is prayer written in syntax. Each algorithm, each calculation is a microcosm of her larger dream, a universe made legible through discipline. The mathematician's serenity and the monk's devotion are kin. We do not build empires of land anymore. We build them from meaning. Stories, brands, movements, each with symbols, followers, laws. They rise, they spread, they influence, they collapse, and are replaced by others. The pattern is Roman, the materials are new. Every movement that seeks universality inherits her ambition. Every philosophy that seeks harmony inherits her structure. Even ideology follows her map, belief radiating from a center, discipline defining belonging. Commerce is Rome reborn in electricity. Where she used coins stamped with emperors, we use numbers encrypted in networks. Where she built markets of marble, we build platforms of code. The flow remains identical. Trust, exchange, regulation, risk, even corruption repeats itself politely as bureaucracy instead of bribery. The same ancient equation persists, faith in the system as the price of peace. Airports are the new harbors, students, the new legions. They travel not to conquer, but to learn. Universities cooperate across continents, their language still Latin in spirit, shared, structured, disciplined. Scholars meet where roads once crossed, now in digital corridors. They debate ethics, climate, culture, the same triad of survival that occupied every Senate. Rome taught conversation, humanity perfected it in dialogue. Religion has changed its voice, but not its need. Temples became data centers, incense became light. The prayer now is curiosity, the faith that order can still be found. Scientists are its clergy, engineers its scribes. The sacred is no longer distant. It is built, tested, shared, and behind each discovery a whisper older than belief, that the universe rewards clarity. Rome's mirrors were bronze, ours are digital. But reflection remains her favorite art. Through screens we watch ourselves continuously. Through networks we reconstruct identity. She invented portraiture, we invented a profile. The same need to be seen, the same performance of belonging. Even our vanity is ancient, but so is our search for meaning and recognition. Amid endless motion, some still seek calm. Modern Stoics quote Marcus Aurelius while scrolling news feeds. They breathe slowly in apartments overlooking avenues of noise. They remember what he wrote. Control what you can, and meet the rest with reason. His Rome is gone, but his practice fits our era perfectly. The empire of noise requires citizens of silence. Global treaties, digital ethics, human rights, all are steps toward a law beyond borders. Rome once dreamed of jus gentium, the law of all peoples. We call it international cooperation. It is the same impulse in broader scale. Justice made portable, order made global. Even the United Nations speaks in her tone, patient, procedural, hopeful. Bureaucracy may be dull, but it is civilization's heartbeat. Modern art bends toward her discipline again. Designers talk of proportion and white space, architects of balance and scale. Even technology follows aesthetics of harmony. The digital interface is the new Roman facade. Clean lines, measured curves, no chaos visible to the user. Behind it, 1,000 mechanisms cooperate, like the city beneath the empire. Simplicity as mercy, order as grace. As our systems grow vast, our challenge becomes human again. To rule is easy, to understand harder. Rome learned it slowly, then forgot. We remember and risk forgetting once more. Empathy is the final frontier of her idea, that order without compassion becomes tyranny, and compassion without order becomes chaos. The world still balances between those poles. Every age imagines it is unique. Every age is another stanza in her poem. She wrote the first verse in clay and courage. We add ours in code and care. Her rhythm remains build, reflect, refine, rebuild. No civilization ends. It becomes a syllabus. It becomes silent, waiting for rediscovery. Rome's story never collapsed, a transformation disguised as dust. And so the light moves again. Not west, not east, but inward. It glows in awareness, in the quiet discipline of understanding. We are not Rome's descendants. We are her continuation. Every decision made with logic, every mercy extended through law, every work built to last is her presence speaking through time. The new light is not conquest, it is comprehension. The empire no longer builds cities, it builds coherence. And coherence, as she always knew, is civilization's truest peace. History is not a line. It turns, it forgets, remembers, repeats. Every generation rediscovers Rome, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in warning. She is both ancestor and mirror, a story we tell to understand the shape of our own ambition. The circle of time closes gently, not in ruin, but in recognition. When we seek progress, we drew her map again. When we seek peace, we whisper her maxims. Her empire was never just territory, it was continuity itself. All that endures begins as flame. Rome burned often, in war, in pride, in rebirth. But fire was never her end, it was her element. Destruction revealed design. Ash cleared the ground for clarity. Every civilization carries its own kindling, ideas, desires, contradictions. When the flame comes, we call it a crisis, but history calls it renewal. From the ashes of indulgence, discipline returns. From the ashes of apathy, purpose rises. Rome's fire still smolders beneath our calm. Each of us inherits her geometry. We build our days in grids. We set alarms, keep ledgers, plan futures. Our minds are cities, streets of thought, forums of dialogue, archives of memory. Order gives us peace, and we confuse it for control. But Rome reminds us control is temporary, structure eternal. The empire within us outlives our intentions. Marcus Aurelius wrote by candlelight, his city trembling outside the palace walls. He spoke to himself, not to power. The universe is change. Life is an opinion. He could not stop the storm, so he described its pattern. Centuries later, we quote him to calm our own chaos. His words are small architecture, measured, enduring, each phrase a marble column against the weather of time. Power, too, repeats its orbit. Ambition hardens into excess. Excess invites revolt. Revolt creates reform. Reform becomes complacency. Complacency decays into ambition again. It is the same geometry traced by empires, companies, nations' hearts. Rome's genius was not to escape the cycle, but to understand it. Her laws assumed human weakness. Her institutions absorbed error like stone absorbs rain. To design for imperfection is the only path to endurance. Every age finds its builders. Some raise walls, others raise awareness. Both inherit her instinct that chaos can be structured kindly. Urban planners, reformers, artists, scientists, they all draw their blueprints in her proportions. Each new order is Rome rehearsed. Each act of clarity a tribute to the civilization that taught us to measure hope. Machines obey law better than men, but men still teach them what law means. Artificial minds now reason as Roman jurists once did, weighing cause, consequence, proportion. Ethics, once debated in marble halls, is coded in circuits. The philosopher's echo has entered the algorithm. The stoic calm that once governed emperors must now guide engineers. Rome's discipline faces its greatest test. Can reason survive automation without losing compassion? Even in data and glass, our restlessness persists. We explore because stillness feels unnatural. We map because mystery feels incomplete. That impulse built aqueducts, then telescopes, then the web of light that circles our planet. Curiosity is Rome's most loyal citizen. It obeys no emperor, but honors her legacy, the courage to ask, the dignity to listen, the patience to understand. Art endures longer than politics. It carries the torch when institutions fall silent. Painters of ruins, poets of loss, filmmakers who retell her fall, each keeps the circle unbroken. We romanticize her collapse because we recognize ourselves in it. We sense that every end is rehearsal, every ruin an instruction. To create is to refuse oblivion. Rome's art never ended, it simply changed the media. What rises must fall. What falls teaches. Every empire believes it is permanent. Rome believed it longest. She learned otherwise. Her fall became philosophy, her ruins, education. Now, when nations tremble, they study her and remember how to rebuild. Decline is not a tragedy. It is a curriculum. Memory does not move forward. It circles back. We study antiquity to recognize tomorrow. We quote the dead to keep the living honest. Each generation walks the same forums, literal or virtual, asking the same questions. What is justice? What is freedom? What endures? Rome answers without words, balance, measure, continuity. The modern citizen stands between chaos and calm, between impulse and design. Every act of patience is a vote for civilization. Every argument settled by reason, a triumph without parade. We carry her republic within us. We are its senate and its crowd. When we choose structure over shouting, we rebuilt her quietly. Fire destroys, but it also illuminates. The same blaze that devours libraries reveals what must be rewritten. The same revolution that topples systems teaches what must be restructured. The flame teaches renewal through humility. Rome burned, but her idea survived. So will ours, if we remember that destruction is only transformation accelerated. Once her light circled the Mediterranean, now it circles the world. Every city touched by law or learning is part of her orbit. And as humanity reaches outward, to stars, to understanding, to futures unnamed, the circle grows still wider. Rome has no need to return. She is already everywhere reason exists. These are the two halves of endurance, order and renewal. The circle preserves. The flame transforms. One holds, the other heals. Rome's lesson was never to choose but to balance them. To burn just enough to begin again. To circle just long enough to remember. Civilization's pulse depends on both. And as long as we learn their rhythm, the empire's heart still beats. Empires fade from stone to memory, from memory to myth, from myth to method. What remains is thought, the architecture within the mind that repeats what the hands once built. Rome survives wherever a person pauses before speaking, before judging, before acting, choosing proportion instead of impulse. The empire moved inward long ago. Her final province is consciousness itself. Each thought is a column, each decision an arch. each dream a dome. Our minds build daily. We construct meaning the way masons once stacked marble. We carve logic from confusion, purpose from noise. Rome's greatest monument was never the Colosseum. It was the habit of deliberation. The temple of reason stands in every head that measures before moving. Cicero argued in public, Marcus Aurelius in private. Seneca wrote to friends, Epictetus to students. All four were architects of serenity, designers of composure. They believed virtue could be taught as geometry is taught, through clarity, repetition, proportion, and through centuries, their logic became our language for balance. The philosopher's continuum never broke, it merely changed its audience. In quiet rooms, people still study them, not for nostalgia, but for navigation. The Stoics speak to stress, the jurists to justice, the poets to loneliness. Rome's books are not relics, they are mirrors, open one, and the reflection is modern. The handwriting may fade, but the rhythm of thought remains legible. The self is not monarchy, it is a republic. Reason debates with emotion, memory advises instinct, imagination votes for wonder. When these forces argue and agree, we are whole. Rome built her Senate to model that balance, order without tyranny, freedom without chaos. Every mindful decision recreates her constitution. All wisdom begins in pause. Rome taught the world to deliberate, to draft before decree, to plan before building, to justify before judging. That rhythm lives on in modern reason. Scientists test before claiming. Courts listen before sentencing. Artists sketch before committing color. Reflection became civilization's instinct. It is law written into thought. There is construction in comprehension. To know something fully is to place each part in harmony. Philosophers design arguments as Vitruvius designed villas, by symmetry, by balance, by care. The Stoic, the scholar, the scientist, each is a builder of coherence. Their blueprints are invisible but durable, and all of them trace lineage to Rome's first drafts of reason. Each age reaches backward to understand itself. Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernity, all were bridges across forgetting. The traffic of wisdom never ceased. It simply crossed new materials, from parchment to paper, from paper to pixel, from pixel to pulse. Every philosopher is an engineer of memory, keeping thought connected across time. Rome's curiosity was practical. She asked not only what, but how to build, how to organize, how to last. That discipline of wonder remains her most enduring gift, to feel awe, but measure it. Modern curiosity carries her patience, the willingness to be precise without losing reverence. Even space exploration follows her method, boldness balanced by geometry. Words were Rome's true legions. They conquered confusion. Latin's precision made law possible, science probable, and poetry is eternal. Its grammar became a philosophy, subject, order, consequence. Today, every logical sentence is a descendant of that syntax. To speak coherently is to think in Roman rhythm. Within the mind, a quieter Senate meets. Ideas propose, memories object, reason moderates. This is dialogue's birthplace, the inner forum of conscience. When we forgive, we pass emotion. When we doubt, we debate. Even solitude is civic. Every thought is political in the ancient sense, concerned with how best to live together, even within ourselves. Understanding requires mapping. We chart ideas, trace cause and effect, measure consequence. We build atlases of memory, networks of knowledge. Each new insight adds another province to the mind. Rome's obsession with surveying land transformed into our habit of surveying thought. Every diagram of logic is a map of the restored empire. Peace is not absence, it is an alignment. The same principle that balances an arch balances emotion. Load distributed evenly, tension absorbed gracefully, form sustained by proportion. That was the Roman secret, peace by engineering. Our minds crave it still, that equilibrium between force and fragility. In design, in ethics, in art, we pursue symmetry because it feels like the truth. Every culture inherits her discipline of care, for detail, for structure, for endurance. Doctors in surgery, lawyers in argument, writers in rhythm, all serve the same devotion to make precision merciful. It is compassion expressed through control. Rome learned it from necessity. We continue it by choice. The final empire has no borders. It cannot be overthrown. It exists wherever thought refuses to decay into impulse. Its currency is clarity, its creed, comprehension. Every human who reasons kindly is a citizen. Every act of understanding extends its frontier. This empire requires no emperor, only attention. And so Rome endures, not in marble but in awareness, In every conversation seeking sense, in every design shaped by proportion, in every conscience that pauses before power, she has become the architecture of thinking itself, an unbroken lineage of comprehension. The eternal mind is not hers alone, but humanity's reflection of her, the calm pursuit of coherence, the humility to rebuild understanding endlessly. Empires rise in earth and fade in dust, but the empire of reason rebuilds itself with every breath. Rome's final triumph was to teach the world how to think with permanence, and that permanence, invisible yet universal, is the peace she always sought. Evening is not a catastrophe. It is the hour when patterns become visible, when light softens and the city reveals its structure in silhouette. Civilizations age the same way. The brilliance that once dazzled becomes comprehension. Triumph turns to texture. Noise yields to memory. Decline, when it comes, is rarely a collapse. It is a thinning of vigilance, of gratitude, of the difficult virtues that keep order kind. Rome knew this hour. So do we. The lesson is not fear but attention. Every great project ends in maintenance. The dome finished, the scaffolds folded, the crowd goes home, and someone stays to listen for cracks. That listener is civilization's conscience. When applause fades, complacency comes dressed as comfort. Budgets shift from building to pleasing, from structure to spectacle. Committees grew where artisans were needed. Titles multiply, craft things. Rome left us a parable, that prosperity is an austerity in disguise. It asks for discipline without urgency, for patience without crisis. Few generations learn to love that labor. Order must be chosen, not inherited. Each morning, a city decides to be itself. Miss a day, nothing breaks. Miss a decade, everything subtle loosens. Roads still look straight, but the milestones fall behind the hedges. Courts still open, but delay becomes a doctrine. Schools still recite, but wonder leaves the room politely unnoticed. Rome's marble hid its slippage. Our glass does the same. Decline is courteous at first. Empires do not die of enemies alone. They die of paperwork. Forms that once protected the weak begin to protect the comfortable. Audits outnumber acts. Metrics replace meaning. Words thicken until deeds cannot breathe. The Romans coined terms for this fatigue. Edicts without enforcement, titles without tasks, process without purpose. A wise age learns to prune its own vines. A proud one lets them strangle the trellis. Spectacle never enters as a villain. It enters as relief. The amphitheater was not built to corrupt, but to coordinate emotion, a ritual release, a civic heartbeat. Yet when spectacle becomes diet, hunger changes. Citizens become audiences. Audiences become markets. Markets become weather, profitable, restless, indifferent. Rome paid for cheers with silence afterward. We pay in hours and call it leisure. The cost is the same. Attention no longer available for the slow work of stewardship. Every inheritance teaches forgetfulness. We grow up inside achievements and mistake them for climate. Water flows, lights answer switches, justice appears on paper with signatures neat as calligraphy. We forget the engineers, the clerks, the teachers, the anonymous republic of competence. And with forgetting comes a smaller sin, impatience with the very people who keep the world coherent. Rome's gratitude faded into etiquette. Ours risks fading into service included. Civilization survives on thank yous more than on taxes. When rules grow old, exceptions dress as wisdom. Only this once, just for efficiency. Until the emergency has passed. The Republic of Law becomes a monarchy of moments. Each exception is reasonable alone. Together they are a policy. Rome wrote this chapter carefully. Emergency powers renewed too easily. Virtue borrowed from tomorrow. Trust spent like a coin. Decline is not lawlessness. It is a lawful privilege. Signed, stamped, filed, and somehow unjust. Wealth is safest when it remembers ritual. Ceremony tells success what it means. Without it, wealth loses story and becomes merely comfort. Rome built virtue into banquet, the guest lists, toasts, restraints, polite architecture against appetite. When we remove the liturgy from abundance, luxury severs from duty. Taste survives for a time, then taste becomes mood, then mood becomes market, and markets do not bury their emperors, they reshelve them. Speed is a triumph that dilutes itself. What arrives instantly rarely arrives with depth. Rome invented the fast road. She also invented the milestone. A road without markers is only acceleration. Our century runs ahead of its breath. News outruns knowledge. Outrage outruns ethics. Production outruns quality. And the citizen, exhausted by velocity, mistakes fatigue for fate. Decline hides in the now when the long is neglected. Not all poverty is material. There is a poverty of attention, a poverty of courtesy, a poverty of shared assumption about what the city is for. When common purpose thins, transaction expands to fill the space. Everything becomes a deal. Nothing is a duty. Rome's late centuries show the symptoms: titles for sale, offices as investments, loyalties portable as coins. We should not read those pages with scorn. We should read them as inventory. They listed what had slipped. We can still tighten what is loose. Empires live by balance between edge and center. Frontiers deliver vigor. The forum delivers law. When one forgets the other, either energy turns feral or order turns brittle. Rome's borders became careers, its core, ceremony. The handshake failed somewhere between the outpost and the oath. Our frontiers are technological now. The risk is the same. Innovation too quick for deliberation, deliberation too proud to learn. No one feels decline earlier than the competent. The aqueduct worker hears the hairline crack. The bridge inspector sees the rust behind the paint. The teacher notices the first grammar that isn't corrected. The clerk sees the rule bent for speed and understands it will bend again. Their warnings are quiet. Decline is loud. Guess which sound the crowd prefers. Rome's miracle workers retired early. We should ask why. Perhaps applause is poorer pay than respect. Civilization lands itself daily on small fields of habit. Repair before replace. Explain before command. Measure before claim. Thanks for criticizing. Rest before rush. Rome sketched these rules in law, in ritual, in calendar. We recite them in manuals now, then forget the deadline. Decline is not a crash. It's landing gear left unfixed because yesterday's landing felt fine. Symbols survive longer than meanings. This is both grace and danger. Togas outlasted the Republic. Triumphs outlasted victory. Titles outlasted tasks. We too can keep the costumes, the words, the ceremonies, the fonts, after their purpose has gone shy. The cure is not iconoclasm, it is recommissioning. Ask every symbol for service. If it cannot work, let it rest as art, and say so aloud. Every stable city pays forward. Maintenance is love letters to strangers. Rome dug sewers that would not praise their engineers. We encrypt archives none of us will read twice. Both are acts of faith, that someone will be here and deserve coherence. Decline begins where debt becomes extraction, when we bill tomorrow for today's ease and call it creative finance. Accountancy is also ethics. Columns do not lie, but they keep our secrets until the audit. Pride is a celebration of forgetting work. It is not wicked, it is weightless. When an age begins to congratulate itself more than it corrects itself, you can date the decline. Rome paraded as if victory were a pension. We trend as if popularity were policy. The mirror is flattering, so is the cliff from the top. The ruins do not scold, they tutor. They say, build with joints that can flex. Share the weight widely. Design for the day someone careless inherits. Guard the drains, always the drains. Write laws like bridges, no single point of failure. Their advice is unromantic and therefore sacred. Limits are civilization's self-respect. They acknowledge the body, its fatigue, its appetite, its edges. The calendar once enforced mercy, feast, fast, festival, rest. Cycles that protected the human machine. Modernity removed the guardrails to go faster and now installs them again with new names. Sabbath as sabbatical, fast as detox, festival as OO. Rome smiled at the same rediscovery. Limits are old technology that never becomes obsolete. The most Roman act left to us is not a law, but a habit. To fix. Fix the step that trips strangers. Fix the sentence that misleads. Fix the meeting that wastes the afternoon. Fix the payment that arrives late and the thanks that never arrives. Each repair is a tiny refusal of decline. No Senate needed, only attention. Decline asks for a strange bravery, not charge, but it's constant. The soldier's courage ends the day. The citizen's courage begins the day. And repeat. Show up, do the unglamorous, say the accurate thing kindly, protect the boring processes, re-explain the purpose, audit without shaming, praise in public, correct in private, sign your name. Rome lasted so long because millions of anonymous courages chose routine over romance. Shadows do not erase the form, they define it. The shadow of decline shows the line we must redraw, from habit to intention, from spectacle to service, from exception back to law. It reminds us that civilization is a verb, not owned, performed. The empire's evening was not a verdict, it was a curriculum. We cannot choose eras, we can choose oaths. Let ours be simple, to leave every system a touch clearer than we found it, to to prefer repair over reinvention when repair will do, to make policies that train character, not merely compliance, to keep ceremonies honest or retire them with thanks, to give gratitude the status of strategy. Rome would have recognized this. She called it mos maiorum, the custom of the elders, the habits that hold. Recovery is not a campaign. It is a doorway taken daily, narrow, unadvertised, always open. It leads to the archives, to the workshop, to the court, to the classroom, the rooms where continuity is built with ordinary tools. Walk through often enough, and the hour of evening becomes a kind of gold, the light by which detail is best seen. A city is not its skyline, it is its choice. Choose proportion when spectacle tempts. Choose patience when speed flatters. Choose law when convenience smiles. Choose gratitude when boredom yawns. Choose a limit when appetite sings. The shadow will remain, that is the nature of evening, but the form will be clear, and clarity is the daylight of endurance. The page does not close here. It bends. Decline is the hinge of renewal, a chance to see the grain of the wood, the stress in the joint, the truth of the weight we carry. Rome's evening taught the morning how to wake wiser. So can ours. The lamps are being lit, the watch is being set. The city exhales, tucks in its ledgers, and listens for the softest noises. Not enemies, but errors. This is how empires sleep without dying, by learning at last to dream responsibly. Every civilization begins with a voice, a command, a vow, a song of belonging. It ends, not with defeat, but with the dimming of that sound. Rome's fall was not a crash, it was a hush spreading slowly through her corridors. Law became precedent, precedent became formality, formality became forgetting. The Senate still met, speeches were still made, but the sentences no longer moved the air. They hung there, elegant and inert, like inscriptions waiting for translation. Words lose gravity when belief departs. The orators still quoted Cicero, the jurists still cited Justinian, but the meanings, repeated too often, hollowed into music. Piety survived as a posture, patriotism as a phrase, virtue as fashion. Rome's decline began in grammar, verbs untethered from action, nouns inflated beyond truth. When language grows ornate, the world beneath it usually frays. There is a fatigue that follows mastery, the wariness of having nothing left to refine. Rome had codified justice, perfected infrastructure, designed comfort, and found herself bored. She had solved her problems and replaced them with policies. The empire's engines still turned, but purpose no longer ignited them. They hummed on maintenance alone. Decline, in every age, feels first like convenience. In healthy republics, argument is oxygen. But in later empires, it became a threat. Rome once trained its citizens to debate, to question command, to call each other to virtue. Then came fatigue. Critique was called disloyalty. Silence was praised as stability. Obedience learned to smile. The voice that once corrected power began clearing its throat, waiting for permission to speak. When dialogue goes quiet, decay begins to whisper. In the final centuries, votes still passed, edicts still announced, but decisions arrived pre-approved. The Senate performed agreement for audiences too tired to care. Rome had turned governance into theater. The costumes remained impressive, but the script repeated. The Republic had become ritual, the Empire, routine. Citizens attended out of habit, then out of nostalgia. Attendance, too, became optional. Indifference feels sophisticated. It spares one the labor of conviction. The rich perfected that elegance first, to admire everything, to commit to nothing. Charity was replaced by patronage. Philosophy became ornament. Virtue became expensive. Meanwhile, the poor learned cynicism, a quieter, hungrier version of indifference. Both sides withdrew into private worlds, and the public one grew empty. An empire can survive invasion. It cannot survive apathy. Faith once bound Rome's days together, rituals at dawn, candles at dusk, prayers for the hearth, for the harvest, for the idea of order itself. Then the prayers became performances. Temples magnificent, but hearts are distracted. Belief thinned to gestures. The gods, ignored, became metaphors. Even reverence can decay through routine. When the sacred becomes schedule, the spirit departs politely. Generations born into greatness inherit comfort without its context. They assume peace is the default, justice automatic, beauty inexpensive. Rome's last heirs wrote elegies for ancestors they could not quite recall. They collected relics, but lost recipes. They quoted philosophers, but forgot hunger. Memory became curation. Heritage became a hobby. and continuity, which once required sacrifice, became museum lighting. Citizenship changed meaning. Once it meant contribution, now it meant commentary. Crowds gathered for games, for news, for gossip disguised as governance. The act of watching replaced the act of doing. Spectators became critics, critics became chorus, and the chorus sang nostalgia and harmony. Rome mistook performance for participation, the oldest, softest kind of collapse. Scarcity disciplines, abundance distracts. The late empire overflowed with information, scrolls, decrees, correspondences, proclamations. Every city hummed with record-keeping. But knowing everything is not the same as understanding anything. When every fact is equal, truth loses hierarchy. Rome was drowning in details while thirsting for meaning. We have inherited that thirst. Security breeds caution, and caution stifles discovery. The bold became careful, the curious, bureaucratic. Rome's last scholars copied texts more than they read them. Preservation replaced exploration. The academy became an archive. When preservation outweighs creation, the light dims. It does not go out, but it forgets how to grow. The danger of success is mistaking reflection for progress. Rome stared lovingly into her image, her architecture, her laws, her art. But the mirror does not create, it repeats. Admiration became inertia. The empire that had once absorbed others now absorbed itself. Reflection replaced expansion, and beauty turned to echo. In every late age, there are quiet geniuses who still repair the aqueducts. They see the cracks, patch the leaks, balance the ledgers without fanfare. They are mocked as old-fashioned, praised as quaint, then forgotten. But their work holds the world a little longer. Civilization survives on the persistence of those who still care after glamour has gone. Rome endured centuries longer because of them. To inherit greatness is to live beside ghosts. They do not haunt, they expect. Their monuments remind, their perfection intimidates. The living measure themselves against the dead and despair quietly. Innovation withers when imitation is safer. Rome's heirs worshipped marble and neglected imagination. The past became idol, the future blasphemy. By the 4th century, Rome's laws filled libraries. Her coinage reached from Spain to Syria. Her roads mapped half the world. And yet her citizens spoke of decline even as they lived in splendor. They sensed it in tone, in weight, in weariness. Decline is not poverty. It is a loss of faith and purpose. An empire can function perfectly after it has already ended in spirit. The city did not fall in a day. It fell in increments of indifference. A decree postponed, a bridge unrepaired, a prayer skipped, a lie unchallenged. Each small lapse forgivable, together irreversible. By the time the gates truly failed, most citizens were indoors, busy with errands, still confident in the eternal city as the smoke rose beyond the hills. Night does not destroy light, it teaches it. The darkness that came over Rome was not punishment, but perspective. Out of it came new faiths, new languages, new beginnings disguised as endings. What we call decline was also distributed. The light scattered, carried in fragments until it found new homes. From those homes, civilization would one day speak Latin again, softly, as a prayer of reason. There was, perhaps, someone, a scribe, a monk, a citizen too old to flee, who watched the lamps go out and kept one flame hidden. That is how continuity survives, not in armies but in caretakers. The world ends many times and always begins again from someone listening in the silence. So the voice faded, not extinguished but transformed. The empire's echo became education. The command became counsel. The anthem became a whisper. Rome did not disappear. She lowered her voice so the next civilization could speak. Decline is not death, it is listening. The pause between verses where the next begins. Every ending has a silence too large to fill. It spreads through corridors, through memories, through the hearts of those who remained. Rome's fall was not the roar of defeat. It was the sound of attention leaving. The streets still held their shape, the stones their patience, but the purpose had gone elsewhere. And in that quiet, the next story began to germinate, in monasteries, in villages, in the minds of those who had nothing left but thought. When armies disbanded, grammar remained. Somewhere in the north, a monk copied Virgil by candlelight, not to praise empire, but to preserve eloquence. He did not know he was planting seeds. He believed he was saving sentences. Yet those lines about love and war and home carried Rome through centuries of reign. Language survived as faith. Each word written was a vow that meaning still mattered. They lived among ruins but built cathedrals of thought. Scriptoria replaced senates. Illumination replaced marble. While cities argued over crowns, they painted alphabets with gold. Each letter is a prayer for continuity. Their discipline was devotion disguised as copying. Their silence was louder than conquest. Through them, Rome became rhythm, a pattern of patience repeating across parchment. Travelers still found their way by the stones she laid, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers of fortune. They followed ghost roads that outlived the empire. Grass covered them, but beneath the alignment remained true. Even ruin kept direction. The roads became metaphors, straightness as salvation, destination as duty. To walk them was to remember the geometry of belief. Where violence ruled, seeds worked quietly. Farmers rebuilt what generals forgot. They learned again the art of season and restraint. In the shadow of fortresses, they cultivated endurance. Every harvest, a small act of rebellion against chaos. Civilization does not vanish. It germinates underground, waiting for the noise above to exhaust itself. Faith crossed the ruins like wind through grass. It no longer needed marble. It needed memory. The cross replaced the eagle, but the instinct was the same, to bind many in one vision. Cathedrals rose where basilicas had stood, their arches repeating Roman logic in sacred form. The empire had become invisible, but its architecture was still teaching the heavens symmetry. In the twilight centuries, learning hides behind loyalty. Philosophers dressed as priests, scientists as scribes. They kept knowledge alive by folding it into liturgy. Under cover of prayer, they studied the world. Under cover of ritual, they reasoned. Rome's reason had learned humility. And humility, paradoxically, was how it survived. Stonemasons, potters, blacksmiths, anonymous inheritors of the empire. They carried proportion in muscle memory. They built bridges like their ancestors, though they no longer knew their names. Every arch, every column, every measured angle was a fragment of civilization reincarnated in craft. When the world forgot the word Rome, I still remembered how to make things stand. In monasteries and markets, teachers gathered in secret. They taught letters, numbers, scripture, song. Each child who learned to read was another torch relit. Education became resistance, a way to rebuild the invisible city. When barbarians ruled the walls, wisdom ruled the whispers. Gothic cathedrals rose like memory stretching upward. They borrowed the Roman arch and turned it into prayer. Their buttresses were logic in disguise, their stained glass, philosophy illuminated. The builders spoke Latin in stone. Every vault was an argument for light. And through those vaulted sentences, the Middle Ages remembered how to reason beautifully. The empire slept, but it was a dream. In that dream, its fragments spoke to each other across borders drawn by war. Ideas migrated faster than armies, geometry from Cordoba, law from Bologna, art from Florence, music from monasteries. Rome was resting, not gone. She was composing. When Europe began to wake, it looked around and realized the world was written in her handwriting. The alphabet, the law, the roads, the calendar, all Roman organs beating in new hearts. Renaissance was not rebirth. It was recognition, a rediscovery that the light had never left, only softened. In the 12th century's light, monks turned scientists. They translated Aristotle, repaired astrolabes, rebuilt argument. Universities formed like constellations, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, each one a new forum. The syllogism replaced the Senate, but the goal was identical, to make the reason public again. Rome's seed had sprouted through 1,000 quiet roots. Artisans returned to cities. Stone became confident again. The crafts of order reawakened. Surveyors, masons, jurists, painters with geometry in their wrists. The same ratio that built aqueducts now built domes. The same patience that wrote laws I now write sonnets. The past, when understood, becomes a resource. Decline, when accepted, becomes soil. Pilgrims once walked for salvation. Now they walk to study. Libraries became holy sites, books, relics. In the margins of manuscripts, scribes debated astronomy. In lecture halls, they tested God with geometry. Every calculation a confession of faith, that truth is coherent. Rome's belief in order had become theology's scaffold. Night never erases. It teaches contrast. From darkness, light learns gratitude. From silence, speech learns purpose. The age of ruin had trained the world to value endurance. When beauty returned, it came modestly, balanced, deliberate, aware of its fragility. The new light owed its gentleness to the memory of collapse. Even before nations, a republic was forming, of thinkers, artists, builders who trusted proportion more than authority. They argued in Latin, agreed in silence, and rebuilt civilization in footnotes and frescoes. Rome's spirit had dissolved into principle, the idea that coherence is mercy. It guided hands unseen. Knowledge became empire, and its citizens were scholars. They conquered ignorance, mapped possibility, governed by curiosity alone. This empire required no conquest, no army, no coin. Its tribute was understanding. It spread farther than Caesar's, to every mind patient enough to study, to every language humble enough to translate. So the night gave what daylight could not, depth. From its stillness grew structure, from its losses, longing, from its silence, songs. Decline had never been death, it was germination. Rome's shadow sheltered the roots of every age that followed. The seed she buried was not empire, but endurance, the discipline to rise slowly, beautifully, again. And when morning came, it found the fields already green. Dawn rose slowly on a changed world. The empire was gone, but its habits remained, its roads, its rituals, its reverence for structure. Villages became cities again. Trade found new routes. Law found new names. The old tongue echoed faintly in new prayers. No one called it Rome anymore, but everyone lived as if she still existed, in the way they built, the way they reasoned, the way they hoped. The world had inherited her posture. The masons of Florence, the jurists of Paris, the poets of London, each rebuilt the same dream without knowing its author. They spoke of proportion, virtue, balance, harmony. The Roman lexicon was reborn as human aspiration. Their cathedrals were republics in stone. Their universities, senates of reason. Their art, law rendered luminous. What had been empire became instinct. What had been command became conscious. By the 15th century, Rome's map was gone, but her constitution had gone underground. She lived in systems, not borders, in the idea that order and freedom need not be enemies. Each city governed itself with some echo of her rhythm, debate before decree, law before leader, duty before delight. Her republic had become invisible, but its citizens were everywhere. Anyone who believed that thought should precede power. Renaissance meant rebirth, but it was, more precisely, recognition. Artists rediscovered anatomy, engineers rediscovered balance, philosophers rediscovered moderation. Yet all this rediscovery was not nostalgia. It was reconciliation, a reunion with an ancestor long misunderstood. Rome returned, not as ruler, but as a muse. The civilization that had once commanded the body now instructed the mind. Brunelleschi drew domes as if they were arguments. Leonardo dissected bodies as if they were laws. Michelangelo carved stone the way jurists carve precedent, respectfully, relentlessly, within proportion. Each artist was a philosopher in pigment, each painting a constitution of beauty. They believed, as Rome once had, that perfection was possible if patience was practiced. The light spread northward, to scholars who replaced devotion with doubt, then rebuilt faith upon reason's foundation. Copernicus redrew the heavens with Roman geometry. Galileo measured motion with Latin precision. Newton's laws read like civic codes for the universe. The cosmos had become a republic. Its citizens are bound by gravity and grace. Rome's legacy had turned outward again, from temples to telescopes, from forums to formulas. Every age names itself by its best light. For the 18th century, that light was reason refined. Philosophers wrote constitutions inspired by Cicero more than kings. They quoted Seneca beside Scripture and framed liberty not as rebellion but as restoration, the revival of an older justice. In their salons and parliaments, Rome's spirit argued calmly again. Across oceans, new cities were founded on her old ideals. Their architects traced blueprints in borrowed Latin. Their courthouses mirrored basilicas. Their charters read like edited fragments of the 12 tables. They sought what Rome had sought, not perfection, but permanence through principle. They wrote "We the People" and believed, sincerely, that the people could be Roman, without ever saying the word. Progress is faith translated into time. It assumes the world can be improved, that tomorrow deserves structure. That faith is Roman at its core. The aqueduct became a factory. The calendar became the clock. Discipline became industry. The same virtues once praised in soldiers were recast as virtues of citizens: order, duty, precision, endurance. Rome's ethics survived in productivity. Her stoicism became a schedule. Then came the revolutions. Empires fell, kings fled, citizens rose, and yet even rebellion followed her logic. Reformers quoted her historians, orator her poems. Liberty spoke Latin. equality, fraternity, reason, each was a Roman virtue translated through suffering. They were not anti-Roman. They were Rome corrected, empire humbled into empathy. Industrial smoke replaced incense. Engines replaced prayers. Yet the aspiration remained identical: to order chaos into rhythm, to make movement predictable, to give labor grace. The machine was not Rome's enemy. It was her mirror, efficiency seeking beauty, discipline seeking mercy. Every engineer who balanced a beam was unknowingly repeating Vitruvius. By the 19th century, Rome had become a curriculum. Her stories, her law, her architecture were taught as the grammar of civilization. Children learned her myths before their own. Her language became a gatekeeper of intellect. To be educated was to be Roman again, briefly in thought. She had become immortal through syllabus. Then came the century that broke faith. Wars vast enough to make even marble flinch. Tanks crossed the old roads. Bombs fell on her forums. Ideologies promised order, then delivered ash. And yet, amid that devastation, Rome's example survived. Because she had already fallen once and risen wiser. Her ruins whispered, "You can rebuild. You already know how." After the wars, Europe turned again to her geometry. Capitals rebuilt their courtyards. Constitutions rewrote their preambles. The dream of unity, so old, so scarred, found a new expression in cooperation. The European Union was not an empire reborn. It was forgiven. Rome's old desire for harmony had learned the cost of conquest. Today, nations gather under banners of peace and procedure. Their chambers echo with translations of ancient rhetoric, appeals to justice, calls to order, pleas for balance. The world debates as Rome once did, imperfectly but earnestly. Every treaty, every summit, every cautious compromise is her Senate meeting again with different accents. Cities rise from concrete in familiar rhythm, grids, plazas, arcs, corridors of light. We still build by her grammar because it feels like home. We still teach by her method because it makes sense. We still argue by her logic because it feels like fairness. Hope itself has Roman proportion, faith measured by discipline. Civilizations are candles, not suns. They burn, they pass flame. Rome's flame was never extinguished, it was multiplied. Every act of reasoning, every law written in mercy, every design that honors symmetry is her fire continued. The light that remains is not nostalgia. It is knowledge refined by endurance. So the world turns slowly, beautifully, still Roman in its pulse. Empires come and go, but the idea of order, that humble human wish for peace through structure, remains. Rome was never eternal in stone. She was eternal in striving. The light she left behind is not above us, but within us. A quiet discipline of understanding, a faith in the patient repair of things. And as long as that light remains, the empire will never end. History is not a straight line. It curves gently back toward itself, an unbroken conversation between the living and the long gone. Every age speaks Latin in its own dialect. Every monument is a translation. The circle of memory begins in gratitude. It turns through reverence and returns through rediscovery. Rome taught the world this rhythm, that to remember is not to look backward, but to turn again toward meaning. The Renaissance remembered Rome through beauty, the Enlightenment through reason, the modern world through endurance. Each chose what it needed. Each reinterpreted the same inheritance. Memory, after all, is creative. It does not copy, it reconstructs. It edits the past until it fits the hunger of the present. That is why the ruins never lose relevance. They adjust to our questions. Ruins are more eloquent than statues. They admit impermanence. They remind us that strength must bend. Tourists see tragedy, scholars see structure, artists see silence turn to form. Each column, half buried, says softly, perfection was attempted. The cracks do not shame the builders. They honor the effort to defy decay. In that effort lies our kinship. For centuries, travelers have come to Rome not to see power, but to feel proportion. They walk through arches of shadow and sun and understand something wordless. That order has a soul. They read inscriptions like prayers left in stone. They whisper in forums where rhetoric once ruled the air. Each footstep adds to the archive of awe. Each gaze continues the conversation. Architects never forget her entirely. Even when they reject her, they quote her by contrast. Modernism calls itself new, but its glass towers are just stripped temples. The rhythm of columns lives in the rhythm of windows. The balance of the dome returns in every skyline. Form remembers what thought forgot. That is Rome's quiet revenge, that beauty cannot betray its origin. Latin became the fossil fuel of intellect. It powers languages that no longer know their source. Doctors diagnose it, lawyers argue with it, scholars annotate by it, its verbs build logic, its nouns built nations. Even silence is partly Latin, the pause between clauses, the measured restraint before reply. Rome designed clarity, and the world kept the blueprint. History preserves events, memory preserves feelings. Rome's grandeur endures in both. We remember her not just as structure, but as sensation, the dignity of scale, the calm of symmetry, the melancholy of endurance. Each visitor who stands before the Pantheon feels that old equilibrium, the stillness large enough to hold thought. Emotion is the empire's most faithful historian. Philosophers still quote Marcus Aurelius to calm modern storms. They find him not ancient, but immediate, because his Rome was not marble or sword, but conscience and composure. The circle turns. We return to his pages not as students, but as peers. His wisdom fits any century. That is what immortality truly is, usefulness without age. Memory behaves like a republic. It governs by consent. Each generation votes for what survives. We choose heroes to admire, lessons to repeat, mistakes to forgive. In that choosing, we shape history's next draft. Rome endures because we keep re-electing her. Every civilization studies her curriculum. They may not know it, but they follow her syllabus. Build order, forget gratitude, decline politely, relearn humility, rebuild. It is not a failure, it is a method. Rome's life was a tutorial in continuity, and the world, though often inattentive, has been a loyal pupil. Museums are her monasteries now. They curate fragments like scripture. A coin, a tile, a stylus, a statue, each relic a syllable of an unfinished sentence. We walk through glass corridors, whispering the same awe the monks once felt in candlelight. To collect is to confess. We are afraid to forget, and fear of forgetting is the root of civilization. Good historians record facts, great ones record texture. They tell us not just what happened, but how it felt to live through it. Rome's chroniclers, Tacitus, Livy, Plutarch, wrote not merely of battles, but of moods, the fatigue of prosperity, the weight of expectation, the melancholy of order. We still read them because they sound familiar. We recognize ourselves in their exhaustion. Awe is the most honest form of worship. It asks for nothing. When we look upon her ruins, we are not praying. We are remembering our own potential. Awe turns past into promise. It reminds us that perfection was human once, and therefore possible again. Walk any modern city, and you walk her echo. Street grids follow her geometry. Courthouses mimic her balance. Even our clocks, our calendars, our currencies follow her sense of sequence. We are surrounded by translation, Rome rewritten in steel and circuitry. The present is the past, redesigned for comfort. The circle closes only to begin again. Each age that rediscovers her adds a new layer to the archive. Artists see proportion, philosophers see virtue, engineers see methods, citizens see warnings. She becomes what we need most. That is why the circle endures, because memory is practical. It keeps what works. Every historian, artist, and teacher makes a silent vow to carry the light forward. It is not a ceremony, it is stewardship. The promise is simple: to keep the circle unbroken, to pass the flame without embellishment, to let memory remain useful, gentle, and alive. To remember Rome is to remember ourselves at our most deliberate. When we study her, we are not romanticizing the past. We are rehearsing composure. Her story is a mirror held to every empire, reflecting both grandeur and gravity, ambition and cost. She reminds us that civilization's highest act is self-awareness. Archives do not glow, but they store light. Every preserved word is a match kept dry. When darkness returns, we reach for those matches, and the world brightens again with ancient wisdom. That is why remembering matters. It is the maintenance of illumination. And so the circle completes itself. Rome is remembered not as monument, but as movement, the rhythm of awareness that refuses to end. Each generation turns, sees her shadow, and walks into it willingly, knowing it will lead toward light. The circle of memory is civilization's heartbeat, steady, enduring, measured in centuries, kept alive by the quiet will to remember well. History has its geography, but light ignores it. Rome's light was never content to stay. It drifted like wind over water, from marble to parchment, from empire to idea. When the city fell, its radiance gathered itself and began to travel again. It moved westward, following curiosity, following trade, following the will to organize hope. Empires end, but direction endures. Those who left Italy carried more than goods. They carried grammar, manners, architecture folded into instinct. Roman law sailed with merchants. Roman discipline marched with explorers. Roman dreams rode with pilgrims. Each ship that crossed the Atlantic carried a ghost of the Forum within its hold. The Republic was reborn as possibility, not memory. On new continents, the Roman pattern reassembled itself. Surveyors traced straight roads through wilderness. Capitals rose on grids. Courthouses stood with domes. Even the languages were half Latin, half faith in order. The settlers thought they were beginning. In truth, they were continuing. Rome's instinct for symmetry had found a new canvas. In Philadelphia, men gathered to debate how free a people could be without falling into chaos. They spoke of law, virtue, citizenship, as if the Senate had reconvened in another hemisphere. Their parchment sounded ancient, clauses measured like edicts, arguments weighed like orations. They dreamed of liberty, but designed it in Latin form. Checks, balances, reason as ruler. The Republic had been rewritten, not replaced. The language of liberty, freedom speaks softly in Rome's tongue. Its roots are legal. Its rhythm is deliberate. Justice, civility, constitution, all words minted in her mint. Every courtroom oath, every civic promise, every pledge of allegiance to fairness echoes her cadence. The empire's greatest export was vocabulary, its destination, the conscience. Across oceans and ages, new cities rose, New York, Washington, San Francisco, each with colonnades and order, each tracing Rome's dream in another light. But the real continuation was not in stone. It was in the belief that a city could represent an idea. Rome had taught the world that civilization was not birthplace, but behavior. The modern city is her heir, a forum of strangers held together by custom, not blood. Universities became her new provinces. Their gowns and rituals, echoes of togas and triumphs, their syllabi still began where hers had ended, with philosophy, with law, with language that refuses decay. Knowledge became the empire that could not fall. Each library was a province of light, each reader a governor of thought. Painters carried her sense of dignity, writers her sense of proportion, musicians her sense of form. Even rebellion was framed within her rhythm, chaos composed beautifully. Rome's restraint became an inspiration. Her symmetry taught passion its limits. In the arts of the West, her echo is constant, measure before motion, feeling guided by form. Democracy, too, owes her its scaffolding. The word Senate endures. The word Republic survives. Even the word citizen is hers. Modern parliaments argue in her shadow. Modern leaders address nations as if speaking from the rostra. The empire became an ethos. Rule became representation. Power learned humility in the ruins of its own excess. From Latin to English, from marble to ink, from scroll to screen, the message persisted. Translation is Rome's truest monument. Every interpreter, every teacher, every patient explainer is another builder of the bridge. Through translation, we inherit coherence. Through coherence, we remain her students. Rome's spirit learned to travel light. It shed its legions, its coins, its claims. What remained was clarity and the will to share it. When Europe fractured in war, the idea escaped again, to America, to Asia, to minds weary of tyranny. The light survives because it migrates. Wherever constitutions were written, her voice was near. Wherever laws restrained power, her balance guided the pen. Wherever poets built verses like arches, her rhythm kept time. Even across seas and centuries, the echo was precise, not imitation but resonance. Rome's melody became humanity's harmony. In the modern world, Rome exists in spirit, not a spectacle. Her grandeur now is quiet, seen in order, in patience, in every deliberate act that chooses structure over noise. We honor her each time we build slowly, judge fairly, or think before answering. Her empire survives in courtesy. The West looked into her reflection and saw itself. Some saw pride, others warning. Both were right. For the mirror shows not perfection but potential. What can be if balance is kept? Every civilization must look at her once to measure itself and remember humility. The light that moved west does not stop at the ocean's edge. It keeps circling, meeting its own reflection in return. In Asia, in Africa, in the voices of new nations, Rome's structure meets new spirit. The world has become the dialogue she began, law conversing with compassion, reason with renewal. The circle closes only to widen. Every empire teaches the next lesson. Rome's lesson was coherence. To think clearly, to build proportionately, to rule with restraint. The West learned, sometimes forgot, and learned again. Now her light belongs to all, no longer imperial but intellectual. It glows in science, in art, in conversation. Civilization is a relay, not a monument. Each age holds the torch briefly, adds its warmth, and hands it on. Rome held it longer than most. She burned brightly, steadily, and left embers that still instruct. The flame now passes silently through every classroom, every courthouse, every sentence written in measured thought. As the sun sets over modern cities, it casts the same light that gilded her domes. The outlines have changed, but the discipline remains. Arches turn to bridges, columns to towers, forums to networks. The light has not dimmed, it has diffused. And in that diffusion, she found eternity. Rome never asked to be remembered, she asked to be understood. Understanding is immortality of the truest kind, a living agreement between minds. Her legacy is not marble, but the method of making meaning last. Each generation rediscovers her, and in doing so discovers itself. The sun sets, but not in silence. Its rays stretch across the ocean, touching every shore, every city that ever borrowed her order, her patience, her peace. The light moves west, as it always has, seeking new minds to illuminate, new hearts to steady, new worlds to make calm. And somewhere beneath the hum of modern life, the Roman rhythm still beats, slow, measured, eternal. The story ends where it began, with light, with hope, with Rome as reminder that civilization's truest empire is understanding. Empires fall, but coherence endures. People change, but purpose remains. And when we look westward toward the fading sun, we see not loss, but inheritance. The world glows still, quietly, patiently, in the light that moved west. And so, our story drifts to its rest. From the banks of the Tiber to the marble halls of empire to the quiet dawns that followed its fall, Rome's light has traveled far. It became memory, then method, then meaning. It became us. If you've listened this far, thank you. You've walked with me through centuries, through echoes and silences, through the calm persistence of civilization. Wherever you are listening tonight, in the dark, at work, on a long road home, I hope this story left you a little more at peace and a little more aware of the quiet endurance within all things that last. Rome never truly vanished. She became a language we still speak, a rhythm we still live by, even when we don't hear her name. And if you've been part of this journey, from the rise, through the fall, to this gentle light that moved west, you've carried her flame too. Thank you for sharing these calm hours with me tonight. I'll see you soon for our next chapter, another quiet story from the long sleep of history. Until then, rest well, let the world slow down, and let the light, as always, guide you gently home.